Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It's funny how memories of certain places stick with you. For me, there's this one patch of forest in the Northeast that I can never seem to forget. Growing up in a small town nestled near those woods, I spent a lot of my childhood exploring trails, fishing in quiet streams, and finding comfort in the whisper of trees. But some memories, they aren't so comforting. I was 27 at the time, just a few years out of college, working as a freelance photographer. My weekdays were a mess of deadlines and editing, but weekends? Those were sacred. I'd pack my gear, lace up my boots, and lose myself in the wilderness for hours on end. This particular weekend, my buddy Keith, one of the few friends who shared my passion for hiking, tagged along. Keith and I had known each other since high school, and though life had pulled us in different directions, our shared love for the outdoors always brought us back together. We had our favorite haunts, familiar trails we could practically navigate blindfolded, but Keith had heard about a new one. It was a little further out, tucked away from the well-traveled paths, and supposedly offered incredible views of the valley. I wasn't entirely sold on the idea. The stories surrounding that area were unsettling, to say the least. Folks in town liked to talk about strange disappearances and eerie sightings, but Keith waved it off as local lore meant to scare tourists. Besides, Head said with a grin, "It's just us. What's the worst that could happen?" The day started like any other hike. We parked at the edge of the forest just as the sun was rising, the world bathed in that soft, golden light that makes everything feel alive. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Keith had packed sandwiches, and I had my trusty thermos of black coffee. The trailhead was easy enough to find, though it didn't have the usual signs or markers you'd see in the state park. Just a narrow dirt path disappearing into the trees. We joked about how off the grid it felt as we adjusted our backpacks and set off. The first few miles were uneventful, almost serene. The trail wound through dense clusters of birch and oak, their leaves a brilliant mix of green and gold. Keith kept up a steady stream of conversation, cracking jokes and sharing updates about work. I nodded along, more focused on the play of light filtering through the canopy and the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath my boots. By late morning, we'd covered about 6 miles. The forest had grown denser, the trail narrower. The sunlight struggled to break through the thick foliage overhead, and the temperature seemed to drop slightly. I remember Keith pausing to retie his bootlaces and muttering something about how quiet it was. He wasn't wrong. For a forest that size, the absence of sound was noticeable. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals. Just the occasional creak of branches swaying in the breeze. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you weren't alone, even when you were. We pushed on, hoping to reach the rumored clearing that Keith had been so excited about. According to his research, or rather, the vague directions he'd gotten from an old hiker at the general store, it wasn't far. Just past the old stone bridge, Head said. But as the hours ticked by, the bridge never appeared. We stopped for lunch around 1 p.m., settling on a fallen log near a small stream. The water was clear, its gentle trickle the only sound for miles. Keith dug into his sandwich while I took a few photos, framing shots of the gnarled roots twisting through the soil and the way the light played on the water's surface. "You know," Keith said, his mouth half full, "this spot is perfect. You should use it for one of your shoots. Maybe bring a model out here, dress them up like a woodland spirit or something." I rolled my eyes at the suggestion, but smiled anyway. Keith had a way of lightening the mood, even when things felt off. Once we were done eating, we packed up and continued down the trail. That's when I started noticing the carvings. At first, they were subtle, small symbols etched into the bark of trees. He thought they were just random graffiti left by other hikers, but something about them felt deliberate. The patterns were intricate, almost ritualistic, and spaced at odd intervals along the path. I took a photo of one, the symbol resembling a spiral with jagged edges. Probably just some bored kid with a pocket knife, Keith said, brushing it off. You're reading too much into it. I wanted to agree with him. After all, what else could it be? But the further we walked, the more frequent the carvings became. We decided to pick up the pace. The path had grown harder to navigate, overgrown with thorny vines and moss-covered roots. Keith was still trying to keep the mood light, but I could sense his unease. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we were starting to feel unwelcome. By the time we found the bridge, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The structure itself was old, its stones weathered and covered in moss. It didn't seem like anyone had crossed it in years. Keith suggested we head back, but something about the clearing on the other side drew me in. It wasn't the picturesque valley had promised, just a small, open space surrounded by towering trees. But there was something about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And that's when I noticed the silence again. Even Keith seemed at a loss for words, his usual humor replaced by a quiet tension. He stepped closer to me, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Let's get going," he said finally, his voice lower than usual. But as we turned to leave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something, or someone, was standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. Keith and I froze where we stood, the air around us feeling unnaturally heavy. My first thought was that it had to be another hiker, someone exploring the woods like us. But as I squinted into the shadows, I realized that whoever, or whatever, was out there didn't move like a person. It was hard to make out any details in the fading light, but the figure was tall and unnervingly still. The way it stood, slightly hunched and almost blending into the trees, sent a chill racing down my spine. I nudged Keith, who was already staring in the same direction. "You see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Yeah," he muttered. "What the hell is it?" Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity. The figure didn't either. It just stood there, watching, or at least I thought it was watching. There were no visible eyes, no discernible face, just a vague silhouette partially obscured by the trunks and branches. Keith was the first to break the spell, shaking his head as if trying to snap himself out of it. "Probably just a tree," he said, though his tone was far from confident. I wanted to believe him, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. Still, I nodded and turned back toward the bridge. "Let's go," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. We hurried back across the stones, the sound of our boots echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. Keith kept glancing over his shoulder, his usually steady pace quickening to match mine. Once we were a good distance away from the clearing, he finally spoke up. "Okay, that was weird," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't respond right away. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what we'd seen, or thought we'd seen. A trick of the light? An oddly shaped tree? But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. "I don't think we're alone out here," I said finally, breaking the silence. Keith let out a nervous laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You're starting to sound like one of those ghost hunting shows, man." We tried to brush it off as we continued along the trail, but the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the forest itself was pressing in around us. The carvings on the trees seemed more ominous now, their patterns twisting and overlapping in ways that made my head hurt if I stared too long. Keith noticed it too. "There's no way all of these were here earlier," he said, pointing to a particularly intricate design etched into the bark of an old oak. I nodded, snapping another photo for later. "Maybe we're just noticing them more now," I suggested, though even I didn't believe that. As we pressed on, the trail seemed to grow more confusing. What had started as a relatively straightforward path now twisted and branched in ways that didn't make sense. More than once, we found ourselves doubling back, only to realize we were heading in the wrong direction. "Did we pass that log before?" Keith asked, pointing to a fallen tree with a distinctive split in its trunk. "I don't know," I admitted. "Everything looks the same." The sun had dipped even lower, casting the forest in a dim, bluish haze. I checked my watch. It was just past 6 p.m., but the fading light made it feel later. Keith pulled out his phone, frowning as he tapped at the screen. "No signal," he muttered. "Figures." I wasn't surprised. We'd known the area was remote, and cell service had been spotty at best even before we'd ventured this far. Still, the realization that we couldn't call for help if we needed to added another layer of unease. We decided to stop and consult the map Keith had printed out, a rudimentary sketch based on the old hiker's directions. Kneeling on the ground, he unfolded the paper and smoothed it out against a flat rock. "Okay, so if the bridge was here," he began, tracing a finger along the lines. But as he spoke, I heard it a faint, rhythmic sound, like something tapping against wood. It was distant at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. "Do you hear that?" I asked, cutting him off. Keith looked up, his brow furrowed. "Hear what?" I motioned for him to be quiet, tilting my head to listen. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, echoing through the trees. Keith's expression darkened as he caught on. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. We both stood, turning slowly to scan the forest. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once, bouncing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. "Maybe it's a woodpecker," Keith offered, though his voice lacked conviction. I shook my head. "That's not a bird." The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Keith and I exchanged a glance, neither of us daring to speak. And then, just as suddenly, it started again, closer this time. "Let's keep moving," Keith said, shoving the map back into his pocket. We didn't bother trying to follow the trail anymore. Our only goal was to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever was out there. But the forest had other plans. The further we walked, the more disoriented we became. Paths that should have led back to the parking lot looped back on themselves, leading us deeper into the woods instead. The trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Every so often, we'd stop to catch our breath and listen. The tapping sound came and went, always just far enough away to keep us guessing. It felt like we were being toyed with, led in circles by something we couldn't see. His words hung in the air, unanswered. I grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. "Come on," I said, my voice tight. "Let's just focus on getting out of here." But the unease was getting to both of us. Keith kept glancing over his shoulder, and I found myself gripping the straps of my backpack so tightly that my knuckles ached. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. We finally came to a small clearing and decided to stop for a moment. Keith pulled out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the encroaching darkness. "Look," he said, his voice trembling as he pointed the light at the ground. There, etched into the dirt, was another symbol, similar to the ones on the trees, but larger, more complex. "What the hell is this?" I asked, crouching down to get a better look. Keith didn't answer. He just stood there, scanning the tree line with the flashlight. And then we heard it again. The tapping. The tapping was unmistakably close now, reverberating through the stillness of the clearing like a slow, deliberate knock on a hollow door. Keith and I spun around at the same time, his flashlight beam slicing through the dense trees. Nothing. Just an endless maze of trunks and shadows. "Did you hear that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Keith nodded, his face pale in the dim light. "Yeah," he muttered. "It's following us." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The forest was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal animals seemed absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Keith pointed the flashlight toward the ground, illuminating the strange symbol we had found etched into the dirt. It looked almost ritualistic, with intricate patterns that looped and intersected in a way that made my eyes feel like they were playing tricks on me. "Who would do this out here?" I asked, crouching down for a closer look. Keith didn't answer. He just kept sweeping the flashlight in wide arcs, as if expecting something, or someone, to lunge out of the darkness at any moment. The tapping started again, louder this time. It wasn't a random noise. It had a rhythm, deliberate and almost taunting. Keith grabbed my arm. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice tight with barely concealed fear. I wanted to agree, to just leave that clearing and not look back, but something about the symbol gnawed at me. It felt like a clue, a piece of some larger puzzle that I couldn't yet understand. "Wait," I said, pulling out my phone and snapping a picture. The flash illuminated the clearing for a split second, casting long, eerie shadows that made my stomach churn. "Let's go," Keith urged, tugging at my sleeve. Reluctantly, I stood and followed him back into the trees, leaving the clearing and its strange marking behind. As we continued, the forest seemed to come alive in ways it hadn't before. Branches creaked overhead, their twisted shapes resembling skeletal arms clawing at the sky. The ground beneath our boots felt uneven, as though it were shifting slightly with every step. And then there were the sounds. It wasn't just the tapping anymore. There were whispers now, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to drift on the wind. I kept turning my head, trying to pinpoint their source, but they were everywhere and nowhere all at once. Keith must have heard them too, because he suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Did you say something?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I replied, my pulse quickening. "Why?" He shook his head, glancing around nervously. "I swear I heard someone talking." I didn't have the heart to tell him that he'd been hearing it too. We pressed on, the flashlight's beam dancing over gnarled roots and decaying leaves. The path had become almost impossible to follow, twisting and splitting in ways that defied logic. It was as if the forest itself were trying to confuse us, to keep us trapped within its endless maze. Keith pulled out the map again, though it was clear he didn't trust it any more than I did. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, tracing a finger along the paper. "We should have reached the main trail by now." I didn't respond. My focus was on something else, a faint glow in the distance, just beyond the next cluster of trees. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing toward the light. Keith squinted, nodding slowly. "Yeah, what is it?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's the first thing we've seen that doesn't look like more forest." Against our better judgment, we decided to investigate. The glow grew brighter as we approached, revealing its source. A lantern, old and rusted, hanging from a low branch. It shouldn't have been there. Keith stepped closer, shining the flashlight on the lantern. It looked ancient, its glass cracked and covered in soot. Yet somehow, the flame inside burned steadily, casting an orange glow that flickered across the surrounding trees. "Who leaves a lit lantern out here?" Keith asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, reaching out to touch it. The metal was warm, almost hot, as if it had been recently lit. "This doesn't feel right," I said, taking a step back. Keith nodded, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "We need to leave. Now." But as we turned to go, the lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting strange, distorted shadows across the forest floor. And then, just as suddenly as we'd found it, the light went out, plunging us into darkness. Keith swore under his breath, fumbling with the flashlight. The beam wavered, sputtering as if the batteries were dying. "Come on," he muttered, shaking it. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint, metallic smell that made my stomach churn. The whispers were louder now, clearer, though still impossible to understand. And then, from somewhere behind us, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves with an eerie rhythm. Keith and I froze, too terrified to turn around. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Keith didn't answer. He just grabbed my arm and started pulling me forward, his flashlight flickering weakly as we stumbled through the trees. The forest seemed even darker now, the shadows deeper and more menacing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerge from the darkness. Keith was breathing heavily, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a growing sense of panic. "This isn't normal," he said, his voice trembling. "None of this is normal." I didn't have the energy to argue. My own fear was threatening to consume me, my thoughts a chaotic blur of confusion and dread. We stumbled onto another trail, or what we thought was a trail. It was narrow and overgrown, the trees on either side pressing in so tightly that it felt like we were walking through a tunnel. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more insistent. I could almost make out words now, though they were fragmented and nonsensical, like someone speaking in a language I didn't understand. Keith stopped suddenly, holding up a hand to silence me. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first I didn't, but then it came, a low, guttural sound, like a growl echoing through the trees. "Run," Keith said, his voice barely audible. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran blindly through the forest, Keith's flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and rocks, each step a potential misstep that could send us tumbling. The whispers had turned into a chaotic cacophony, overlapping voices that rose and fell in haunting tones. They weren't just coming from behind us anymore. They were everywhere. Keith suddenly stopped, nearly causing me to collide with him. "What are you doing?" I hissed, my voice hoarse from the cold air and rising panic. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed ahead with a trembling hand. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Just more trees, their branches swaying in a non-existent breeze. But then, through the dense foliage, I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the faint light. It stood perfectly still, its silhouette blending with the shadows of the forest. My heart felt like it stopped. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Keith nodded, his grip tightening on my arm. "What? What is that?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, or at least I thought it was. It was hard to tell. Its features were obscured by the darkness, its outline indistinct and blurry, like a smudge on a window. Keith raised the flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The figure vanished. "Where did it go?" Keith asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my pulse pounding in my ears. We didn't have time to wonder. A loud crack echoed through the forest, like the sound of a massive branch snapping underfoot. It came from behind us. We spun around, the flashlight swinging wildly. For a moment, the forest was a blur of shadows and light. And then we saw it, a second figure, identical to the first, standing just a few feet away. This one was closer, close enough that I could make out its face. Or rather, the lack of one. Its features were smooth and featureless, as if someone had erased them completely. "Run!" Keith shouted, shoving me forward. We sprinted through the trees, the flashlight bouncing erratically in Keith's hand. The figures were everywhere now, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. No matter which direction we turned, they were there, silent, motionless, and watching. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled into another clearing. This one was different from the others we'd seen. It was unnaturally symmetrical, a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by towering trees. In the center of the clearing stood a large, ancient-looking stone, its surface etched with the same strange symbols we'd seen earlier. The air around it felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Keith dropped to his knees, his flashlight clattering to the ground. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, though the answers seemed to be written all around us. The symbols on the stone were glowing faintly, pulsating with an otherworldly light that made my skin crawl. As we approached the stone, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They weren't just in the air anymore. They were inside my head, twisting and writhing like a nest of snakes. Keith reached out to touch the stone, his fingers trembling. "Don't!" I shouted, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. The moment his hand made contact with the stone, the clearing erupted in a blinding light. The force of it knocked us both to the ground, the air filled with a deafening roar that drowned out even the whispers. When the light faded, the forest was silent. The figures were gone, the whispers had stopped, and the stone was dark and lifeless. Keith and I lay on the ground, gasping for air. My body felt heavy, my limbs trembling with exhaustion and fear. "What? What just happened?" Keith asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something had changed. As we picked ourselves up, a new sound reached our ears, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. It was coming from the edge of the clearing, where the trees cast long, jagged shadows across the ground. Keith shone the flashlight toward the sound, revealing a pair of glowing eyes staring back at us. They were large and unblinking, their yellow way contrasting sharply with the darkness around them. "Run," I said, my voice barely audible. We bolted, the creature's growls growing louder as it pursued us. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and warping into grotesque shapes. Keith tripped and fell, the flashlight slipping from his grasp. I stopped to help him up, but the creature was already upon us. It was massive, its body covered in matted fur that seemed to ripple with unnatural energy. Its face was a grotesque blend of human and animal features, its mouth filled with sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Keith screamed as the creature lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air. I grabbed a nearby branch and swung it at the beast, the impact barely making it flinch. "Go," Keith shouted, shoving me away. "Run." I hesitated, torn between helping my friend and saving myself. But the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. With tears streaming down my face, I turned and ran, the creature's growls echoing behind me. I don't remember how long I ran, or how far. All I know is that when I finally stopped, I was alone. The forest was silent again, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But the fear lingered, a constant reminder of what it'd seen and what it'd lost. I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking with sobs. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me, suffocating and unrelenting. And then, from somewhere deep within the forest, I heard the tapping again. I sat on the forest floor, staring into the shadows that surrounded me. My breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. The tapping sound echoed again, soft yet deliberate, like a taunt. Keith was gone. The thought hit me like a hammer, driving home the reality I had been trying to suppress. My best friend was gone, taken by something I couldn't explain or even begin to understand. For a long time, I stayed where I was, frozen in place. The silence around me was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. It was as if the forest had gone back to sleep, indifferent to the horrors it had unleashed. Finally, I forced myself to stand. My legs felt like jelly, my whole body aching from the ordeal. I didn't know where I was or how to get out of this cursed forest, but staying put wasn't an option. I picked up Keith's flashlight, the only thing he had left behind, and started walking. The beam was weak, flickering with every step, but it was better than nothing. The forest seemed different now, quieter and darker, as if it were watching me. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump, my eyes darting to every shadow. But the figures were gone, and so was the creature. I tried to retrace our steps, but the landscape was unrecognizable. The trees all looked the same, their gnarled branches twisting together like skeletal hands. The trail we had followed earlier was nowhere to be found. I thought about Keith, about the sacrifice he had made. Guilt gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. I had left him behind. I had run when he told me to. "Keith," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. I couldn't tell anymore. Time seemed meaningless in this place. My phone was dead, and my watch had stopped working at some point during the night. As I wandered aimlessly, I started to notice something strange. The symbols. They were everywhere, carved into tree trunks, etched into rocks, even scratched into the dirt beneath my feet. It was as if the forest itself was alive, its veins coursing with these ancient, cryptic markings. I couldn't escape them, no matter how far I walked. The whispers returned, faint and disjointed, like fragments of a forgotten language. I tried to block them out, but they grew louder with every step. Eventually, I stumbled upon another clearing. This one was smaller than the last, its center dominated by a shallow, stagnant pool of water. The surface was eerily still, reflecting the twisted branches above like a cracked mirror. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But something about the pool drew me in. It felt significant, like it held the answers I'd been searching for. I knelt by the water, the flashlight casting a dim glow over its surface. For a moment, I saw nothing but my own reflection, pale, gaunt, and haunted. And then I saw Keith. His face appeared in the water, distorted and blurred, but unmistakably his. He was staring up at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Help me," his voice echoed, faint and broken. "Please." I recoiled, nearly dropping the flashlight. The image vanished, leaving only my reflection behind. "Keith," I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the soft ripple of the water as it settled. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring at the pool. Part of me wanted to dive in, to reach for Keith and pull him out. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Whatever this place was, it didn't follow the rules of the world I knew. Eventually, I forced myself to stand and walk away. The whispers grew louder as I left the clearing, a chaotic symphony of voices that seemed to follow me. Somehow, against all odds, I found the trail again. It was faint and overgrown, but it was there, a lifeline in the endless sea of trees. I followed it without hesitation, my legs moving on autopilot. The whispers began to fade, replaced by the distant hum of civilization. When I finally stumbled out of the forest, the sun was just beginning to rise. The sight of the road brought tears to my eyes, a symbol of safety and normalcy after the nightmare I had endured. I flagged down a passing car, a kind older man who took one look at me and knew something was wrong. He didn't ask many questions, just drove me to the nearest town and dropped me off at a small diner. Inside, I sat at a booth, staring blankly at a cup of coffee the waitress had placed in front of me. The warmth of the diner felt surreal, like I had stepped into another world. Keith was gone. The thought hit me again, harder this time. I had escaped, but at what cost? I filed a report with the local authorities, but they didn't seem to take me seriously. They said the forest was dangerous, that people got lost in there all the time. But when I mentioned the figures and the creature, their expressions changed. One of the officers pulled me aside and told me, in a hushed tone, that the forest had a reputation. Strange things happened there, things that couldn't be explained. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, his voice grave. I returned home a few days later, physically safe but mentally scarred. The memories of that night haunted me, replaying in my mind like a broken record. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Keith's face, heard his voice calling for help. The guilt was unbearable, a constant weight on my chest. The forest had taken him, and I had no way of getting him back. Weeks turned into months, but the nightmares never stopped. I tried to move on, to rebuild my life, but a part of me was still trapped in that forest, lost and searching for answers. And sometimes, late at night, I would hear it, the faint tapping, coming from somewhere in the darkness. It's been over a year since that night in the forest. A year filled with sleepless nights, unanswered questions, and a hollow ache that refuses to leave. Keith's disappearance became a local mystery, whispered about in hushed tones, but never fully addressed. The official search parties turned up nothing. No trace of him, no evidence of what happened. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. But I knew the truth, or at least my version of it. I've tried to tell my story a few times. First to the police, then to friends, and eventually to a therapist. But every time, I'm met with skepticism or outright disbelief. They say trauma can distort your memory, the therapist had said, her voice calm and measured. It's possible your mind is trying to make sense of a tragic event by creating a narrative. But this wasn't just a story my mind had conjured up. I knew what I saw, what I felt. The tapping, the symbols, the figures, they were real. And so was Keith's sacrifice. I stopped trying to explain it after a while. People didn't want to hear it, and I couldn't blame them. The truth was too strange, too horrifying. So I learned to keep it to myself, burying the memories deep down where they couldn't hurt me. But the forest never really let me go. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I'll hear the faint tapping sound, the same one that haunted us that night. It's always distant, just on the edge of perception, but it's enough to send me spiraling back into that nightmare. I've moved twice since then, hoping that putting distance between myself and the forest would help. But it doesn't matter where I go. The memories follow me, a constant reminder of what I lost. I've tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation for everything that happened. Maybe the forest triggered some kind of shared hallucination. Maybe Keith and I were just two unlucky hikers who stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. But deep down, I know better. There was something in that forest, something ancient and malevolent. Something that feeds on fear and loss. I've gone back to the forest once. It wasn't a planned trip. I just found myself driving down that familiar road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I reached the edge of the forest, I parked the car and got out, my legs trembling beneath me. The air was heavy, the same oppressive stillness I remembered from that night. I didn't go in. I couldn't. But I stood there for a long time, staring into the shadows, hoping for something. Closure, maybe. I thought I heard Keith's voice, faint and distorted, calling my name from deep within the trees. But when I strained to listen, it was gone, replaced by the rustle of leaves in the wind. I haven't been back since. Whatever answers the forest holds, I'm not sure I want to find them. Now I focus on the little things, my job, my hobbies, the few friends I've managed to hold on to. But there's always a part of me that's missing, a void that can never be filled. I keep Keith's flashlight on my nightstand, its beam long since dead. It's a small, fragile connection to him, a reminder of the bond we shared. And sometimes, when the nights are quiet and the world feels far away, I'll pick it up and hold it tightly, as if it could bring him back. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that some places aren't meant to be understood. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But even so, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if we had never gone into that forest? If we had stayed home that weekend, safe and sound? This is a story I've carried with me for years. It's one I don't share often, not because I don't want to, but because there's something about saying it out loud that makes it feel too real. It's the kind of memory that lingers in the back of your mind, scratching at the edges of your thoughts when you least expect it. It all started in the fall of 2012. I was 29 then, trying to balance the weight of a demanding job and the need to reconnect with myself. Weekdays were filled with long hours and the constant hum of fluorescent lights in a corporate office. But weekends? Weekends were my escape. I'd throw on a pair of hiking boots, pack some essentials, and lose myself in the wilderness. On this particular weekend, I decided to head out to a lesser-known trail about 2 hours from the city. It wasn't one of those postcard perfect hiking spots people flock to. This one was different, rugged, quiet, and tucked away from the usual noise of the world. A friend of mine had mentioned it once, calling it untamed, and that was enough to get my curiosity going. I set out early Saturday morning, the kind of crisp fall morning where the air bites just enough to remind you winter isn't far off. The drive was uneventful, with winding roads framed by trees just starting to shed their leaves. I had the windows down, the cold air whipping through the car, filling it with the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. The trailhead was easy to miss, just a small wooden sign partially obscured by overgrown bushes. When I pulled into the gravel lot, there were only 2 other cars parked there. That suited me just fine. I wasn't there to socialize. I was there for the silence, the kind of silence you can only find deep in the woods. After a quick stretch and a sip of water, I slung my backpack over my shoulder and set off. The first mile of the trail was unremarkable, just a steady incline with the occasional glimpse of sunlight breaking through the canopy above. Birds chirped in the distance, and the sound of leaves crunching under my boots was oddly satisfying. I'd walked maybe an hour when I stumbled upon a small clearing. It wasn't anything special, just a patch of grass surrounded by trees, but something about it felt off. It wasn't the way the trees seemed to lean inward, almost as if they were guarding the space. It wasn't the eerie quiet that blanketed the area either. No, it was the fact that there were no signs of life, no squirrels darting up trunks, no birds fluttering from branch to branch. Just stillness. I shook it off and kept going, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But as I continued down the trail, that feeling of unease stuck with me, like a faint hum I couldn't quite ignore. By midday, it covered about 5 miles. I found a spot to sit and eat, a flat rock overlooking a shallow creek. The water babbled softly, and for a moment, I felt myself relax. The woods weren't trying to scare me. They were just indifferent, vast. They didn't care about me or my presence. After lunch, I checked my map. I'd planned to take a loop that would eventually bring me back to the trailhead by late afternoon. It wasn't a long hike, but the terrain was rugged, and the solitude was starting to weigh on me more than I expected. As I packed up and started walking again, the sky began to shift. Clouds rolled in, dulling the sunlight and casting a grayish way over the landscape. I picked up my pace, not wanting to be caught in the rain, but something about the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just the weather. The forest felt heavier. By the time I reached a fork in the trail, I noticed something strange. The wooden sign that should have pointed me in the right direction was missing. All that remained was a post with jagged edges where the sign had been. I pulled out my map again, trying to figure out which way to go, but the dense forest around me made it hard to get my bearings. I decided to head left, trusting my gut more than the barely legible map. The path was narrower here, with roots and rocks jutting out like they were trying to trip me. I had to watch every step, but even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was just the forest playing tricks on me, the way shadows move when the wind rustles the branches. But the more I walked, the more certain I became. I wasn't alone. As I followed the narrow trail, the forest seemed to press closer with every step. The trees arched over the path like a cathedral of shadows, their gnarled branches reaching out as if to grab hold of anyone passing through. The air felt heavier, colder, and quieter. The usual hum of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of birds, the distant scurrying of small animals was conspicuously absent. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel natural. At first, I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was just the weather, the approaching clouds dampening the usual sounds of the woods. But as I trudged further, a nagging thought took root in the back of my mind. It'd taken the wrong path. The realization came slowly, creeping up on me like the shifting shadows around me. The terrain didn't match what I'd seen on the map. Instead of gradually sloping downward toward the creek, the trail seemed to climb higher, the trees growing denser and the ground rockier. I told myself it'd simply misread the map and that I could double back if needed. But even as I tried to reassure myself, the unease gnawed at me. About an hour passed before I noticed something odd. The trail, which had been well trodden and clear earlier, now seemed overgrown and unkempt. Vines crawled across the path, and patches of moss clung to the rocks, making the ground slippery and uneven. It was as if no one had walked this way in years. Then I saw it, a small object lying in the middle of the trail, half buried under a thin layer of dirt and leaves. At first glance, it looked like a piece of trash, something carelessly discarded by a previous hiker. But as I got closer, I realized it was something much stranger. It was a shoe. Not a modern hiking boot or a sneaker, but an old leather shoe, cracked and weathered with age. The kind you might see in a history museum or a black and white photograph. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong here, or in this century. I stopped and stared at it, my pulse quickening. A part of me wanted to pick it up, to examine it more closely, but another part screamed at me to leave it alone. There was something unsettling about the way it just sat there, perfectly positioned in the middle of the trail, like it had been placed there deliberately. I crouched down, trying to get a better look without touching it. The leather was dry and cracked, the sole barely hanging on by a thread. It wasn't just old, it was ancient. And then I noticed something even more disturbing. There were no footprints around it. The ground was soft from the recent rain, and my own boots left clear impressions with every step. But the dirt and leaves surrounding the shoe were undisturbed, as if it had simply materialized out of thin air. I straightened up and took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe someone had dropped it here months ago, and it had just been uncovered by the wind or an animal. Maybe. But the rational part of my brain was quickly losing ground to something more primal. Fear. I decided to keep moving, leaving the shoe behind. My pace quickened, my eyes scanning the trail ahead for anything else unusual. But the further I walked, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The air felt colder now, biting at my skin, even though I was sweating from exertion. And that eerie silence, it was deafening. Then I heard it. A faint sound, so soft I almost thought it imagined it. It came from somewhere behind me, distant but distinct. A faint rustling, like leaves being disturbed. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trail behind me. There was nothing, just the empty path stretching back into the shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence like a gunshot. No response. I waited, my ears straining for any sign of movement. The rustling had stopped, replaced by that suffocating stillness. After what felt like an eternity, I turned back and continued walking, my senses on high alert. But I didn't make it far before the sound came again. This time, it was louder, closer. Not just rustling, but the distinct sound of footsteps crunching on leaves. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. "Is someone there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. Again, no response. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was following me. I stood there, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my eyes darting from tree to tree. The forest seemed alive now, every shadow and movement taking on a sinister quality. I thought about turning back, retracing my steps to the clearing where it had lunch. But the thought of walking past that shoe again sent a shiver down my spine. Instead, I pressed on, my pace quickening with every step. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, the overgrown vegetation clawing at my legs as I pushed forward. My mind raced, a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. Who or what was out there? And why were they following me? The footsteps came again, closer this time. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Instead, I started running. The pounding of my boots against the uneven trail echoed in my ears as I ran, the sound blending with the shallow rasp of my breathing. The forest had transformed entirely. It was no longer the tranquil, sunlit retreat I had entered earlier. Now it was a labyrinth of shadows, the kind that played tricks on the eyes and distorted reality. I didn't dare look back. Something inside me told me I wouldn't like what I saw. The footsteps behind me had grown louder and more deliberate, as if whatever or whoever was following me no longer cared to mask its presence. The trail twisted sharply to the right, and I skidded to a halt, nearly losing my balance on the loose rocks. As I caught myself, I noticed something ahead. The path had split into two. I froze, my mind scrambling to recall the map I had studied earlier. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't remember a fork in the trail. Panic surged through me as I realized I had no idea which way to go. The footsteps stopped. It was the silence that unnerved me the most. Not the eerie quiet of the forest from earlier, but the abrupt absence of sound, like the world itself had been muted. I turned slowly, expecting to see someone, anyone, standing behind me. There was nothing there. Just the trail I had come from, shrouded in shadow. I swallowed hard, the dryness in my throat making it difficult. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. That's when I noticed something else, something that made my stomach lurch. The shoe. The same battered, ancient shoe I had passed earlier was now lying on the ground, just a few feet away. How was that possible? I had left it miles back. There was no way it could have gotten here, unless someone had brought it. I took a step back, my heart racing. The shoe sat there, its empty toe pointed in my direction like an accusation. My breathing grew erratic as my mind cycled through every possible explanation, none of which made sense. The sound came again, this time not footsteps, but a low, guttural noise, like the creak of an old tree bending in the wind. Except there was no wind. The forest was utterly still. I whipped my head around, scanning the trees for the source of the sound. My vision blurred as I turned too quickly, the shadows dancing and merging into one another. And then I saw it, or thought I did. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but there was no mistaking the silhouette of a person. They stood motionless, their head tilted slightly to one side as if observing me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No response. I took a step forward, squinting to get a better look. The figure didn't move. It was as if it had been carved from the shadows themselves, an indistinct mass that seemed to blend seamlessly with the trees around it. "Hello?" I tried again, my voice barely more than a whisper now. As if in response, the figure took a step closer. My blood turned to ice. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. My heart hammered against my ribcage as I turned and bolted down the left fork of the trail, not caring if it was the right way. I just needed to get away. The forest seemed to come alive as I ran. Branches clawed at my arms and legs, tearing through the fabric of my jacket. The ground became treacherous, the moss-covered rocks slick beneath my boots. I lost my footing more than once, my knees slamming into the dirt as I scrambled to keep going. And all the while, the footsteps behind me grew louder. It wasn't just one set of footsteps anymore. It sounded like multiple people were following me, their steps falling in an uneven rhythm that sent chills down my spine. The trail opened up into a small clearing, and I skidded to a halt, gasping for breath. The sunlight had almost completely vanished, leaving the clearing bathed in an otherworldly twilight. In the center of the clearing stood something that made my breath catch in my throat. A wooden structure, small and crude, like an old hunting blind or a lean-to. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, the wood warped and rotting, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Something about it felt wrong. I stepped closer, the ground crunching softly beneath my boots. The air around the structure felt colder, and the smell of damp wood and decay grew stronger with each step. The door, if you could call it that, hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. My rational mind screamed at me to stay away, to turn around and keep running. But curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the better of me. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the kind of smell that clings to you long after you leave. The interior was empty except for a single chair in the center of the room. The chair was unlike anything it ever seen. It was old, impossibly old, with ornate carvings etched into the wood. Symbols I didn't recognize spiraled across the backrest and arms, their intricate designs both beautiful and unsettling. I stepped closer, my eyes drawn to the carvings, despite the growing sense of dread in my chest. As I ran my fingers over the symbols, a sharp pain shot through my hand, and I pulled back, staring in disbelief. A thin line of blood trickled down my palm. The carvings were sharp, almost razor-like, as if they had been designed to cut anyone who touched them. I backed away from the chair, my pulse racing. And then I heard it. A voice! It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder, more insistent. It didn't sound like it was coming from outside or even inside the structure. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere. The words were unintelligible, a string of sounds that didn't form any recognizable language. But the tone was clear, angry, accusing, and relentless. I stumbled out of the structure, my mind racing. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel the presence of something watching me, closing in. And then, in the distance, I saw a light. A small, flickering light, like a lantern, swaying gently in the darkness. It was coming from further down the trail, beckoning me forward. Despite every instinct telling me to stay put, I followed the light. The faint, swaying light ahead grew brighter as I moved toward it, my legs shaking beneath me. My breath came in ragged gasps as the forest around me seemed to close in, its shadows thickening, pressing in on me from every direction. The oppressive silence, which had been my constant companion, now felt like a suffocating weight, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking toward the light. It could have been minutes, hours, or mere seconds, but it didn't matter. The forest had become a labyrinth of time and space, where the rules of reality seemed to bend and break. The only thing that mattered was the light. As I drew closer, I could make out the source. A lantern hanging from an old wooden post at the edge of the trail. It swung gently in the air, though there was no breeze. The flame inside flickered violently, casting strange, warped shadows that danced on the trees like restless spirits. My hands trembled as I reached for it, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had come this far. I grasped the lantern's handle, its cold metal sending a shock through my fingers. The moment I touched it, the ground beneath me shifted, and I staggered back, barely catching myself. The trail beneath my feet had changed. It wasn't the same path I had followed before. The dirt was darker, almost black, and the trees around me seemed to twist and bend unnaturally, their branches like clawed hands reaching down to grab me. A low, guttural noise vibrated in my chest, and I looked up, heart pounding. The figure, the one I had seen earlier, was there. It stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes boring into me, cold and lifeless. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice echoed, though the figure did move its lips. The words weren't spoken aloud, they were felt, deep in my bones, as if they were an unspoken truth. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my words caught in my chest. I could only stare, frozen in place. The figure stepped forward, the air around it growing colder, and I felt a deep, primal fear clawing at my chest. What? What do you want from me? I finally managed to croak, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer, but the air around it seemed to vibrate with a strange energy. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread flood through me, as if I was on the edge of something ancient and dangerous, something that had been waiting for me. The trees groaned, the wind howling through the branches in a strange chorus of whispers. Without warning, the figure moved closer, and I instinctively took a step back, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. My heart raced as I realized I was cornered. The clearing had closed in around me, the trees now pressing against the edges of the path. And then it touched me. The moment its cold, dead fingers made contact with my skin, a surge of images flooded my mind. I saw flashes, terrifying flashes, of faces, twisted in agony, their eyes pleading for help. I saw the forest, not as it was now, but as it had been long ago, when it was full of life, when people had walked these paths, unaware of the darkness that would consume them. The pain was unbearable. It was as if the very memories of the forest, its history, its tragedies, its untold secrets, were being forced into my mind. I saw it all, the lost souls, the forgotten rituals, the endless cycle of death and despair that had plagued this place for centuries. And in the center of it all, I saw a name I knew, yet couldn't place. Leave, the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't the figure. It was coming from all around me, from the trees, from the very earth itself. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The ground beneath me began to crack, a deep rumble shaking the earth. The trees bent toward me, their branches stretching like arms trying to pull me into the dark abyss that now yawned open at my feet. My mind was a blur of fear, my senses overwhelmed by the nightmare unfolding before me. In that moment, I realized what was happening. This wasn't just a haunted forest. This was something far older, far darker. This place, this land, had been cursed long before I had set foot in it. The figure, the presence that had been following me, was part of it. It was the embodiment of the forest's twisted history, a manifestation of its anger and its sorrow. I tried to move, to escape, but the weight of the air was too much. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Everything around me was closing in, and I was drowning in it. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The figure withdrew its hand, and the oppressive air lifted. The trees, the shadows, the ground, everything returned to its normal state, as if nothing had happened. The lantern in my hand flickered and then went out, plunging me into complete darkness. The only sound was my own breathing, shallow and frantic, as I stood there, trembling. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer alone in this forest. Something had marked me. Something had claimed me. The figure was gone, but the terror it had left in its wake would never leave me. The forest, once again, was silent. The chill that gripped me in that moment wasn't just from the air or the trees. It was something deeper, a feeling that had settled into my bones. The terror wasn't just from what I had seen, but from the realization that this place was alive, alive in a way I couldn't comprehend. The figure wasn't just a person or a shadow. It was the forest itself. And the worst part? I was part of it now. I stumbled back, my legs barely holding me up, my mind racing. My heart pounded, my body covered in cold sweat. I was no longer just a visitor in this place. I had become part of its cursed history. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. I felt like I was being watched, even though I knew the figure was gone. There was no way I could make sense of what had just happened. My mind refused to process the enormity of the encounter. All I knew was this: I had to get out. I had to leave before whatever was lurking here came for me again. But as I turned to run, a voice, faint and distant, echoed through the trees. A voice I would never forget. "Stay!" The air around me was thick with the weight of what had just happened. The forest had returned to its eerie silence, yet I could still feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating every breath I took. I had to get out. I had to leave before whatever force had claimed this land came for me again. But as I turned and stumbled in the direction I thought would lead me to safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees themselves were shifting, subtly blocking my path, guiding me deeper into the heart of the forest. I didn't know how long I had been walking, minutes, hours, or maybe even days. Time had become irrelevant the moment I touched that lantern, when the figure had reached for me. The very fabric of reality seemed to have unraveled, and I was trapped in this waking nightmare. Each step I took was heavier than the last. My legs, already weak from the fear that had seized my body, began to give way beneath me. The forest floor, once familiar and inviting, now seemed to pulse with life, an oppressive energy that pressed down on my chest. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig, felt like it was a warning, an omen of something worse yet to come. I stumbled again, my hand brushing against the rough bark of a tree as I steadied myself. The woods around me were darkening, the shadows growing longer, and a sickening realization settled over me. I wasn't alone anymore. The figure was still here, somehow, watching me from the corners of my vision. Even as I fought to shake the thoughts, the feeling of being observed grew stronger with each passing moment. I had to get out. But then, in the distance, through the thick trees, I saw it. A clearing, a break in the forest, a path that led to freedom, or so I thought. My heart raced, my feet moving faster as I broke into a run, the weight of the dark forest at my back urging me forward. The clearing was so close now. I could taste the fresh air beyond the trees, the promise of escape. But the moment I crossed the threshold of the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. It was the same place, the same cursed spot I had tried to leave earlier. The lantern, the twisted trees, the dark figure standing in the distance, waiting. I had returned to the heart of the forest. The dread that had been gnawing at my mind intensified. I couldn't escape. There was no way out. I was trapped, and the figure wasn't just a ghostly presence. It was the forest itself. The land, the spirits of those who had been lost to it, all trapped in an endless loop of despair. And now, I was part of it. The voice echoed again, soft but forceful, as though it were inside my mind. "Stay!" I dropped to my knees, my chest tight with panic, tears welling in my eyes. I had never felt so helpless in my life. The forest had claimed me. There was no escape. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps that were moving closer. Not the figure. This was something different. I turned, heart racing, expecting to see more shadows emerging from the trees. But instead, I saw a figure that wasn't part of the forest. It was human, its outline clearer, more solid than the specter I had encountered before. The figure stopped in front of me, a man, tall and weathered, with a thick beard and clothes worn by the years. He looked down at me with eyes that seemed to see through me, his expression grim, almost sorrowful. "You should not have come here," he said, his voice rough, as if he had been speaking for years without rest. I tried to leave. "I don't know what's happening," I gasped, my voice cracking. The man nodded solemnly, his face pale, as though he had been living with this curse for far too long. "The forest doesn't let go easily. Once you're in, it takes hold of you. It won't let you leave until it's done with you." I scrambled to my feet, my hands trembling as I looked around. What do I do? How do I get out? The man studied me for a long moment, his gaze hardening as if weighing something terrible. "There's no escaping it, not completely. The forest marks those it claims. You may leave, but you will always carry a part of it with you. You'll hear it calling even when you're far away. And one day, it will come for you again." I took a step back, my chest tightening with fear. "So there's no hope? I can't escape?" He shook his head slowly. "Not unless you break the cycle. But that's a price few are willing to pay. The forest, it feeds on fear, on pain. If you want to rid yourself of it, you'll have to confront what it is that haunts you. Only then will it let you go." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and my mind raced. Could I face whatever darkness had followed me all this time? Could I truly confront the forest, or would I be swallowed whole by it? I didn't know. I couldn't know. But in that moment, I realized something. I had already begun my journey out of the forest, even if the path ahead was uncertain. I had survived. I wasn't going to let the forest claim me without a fight. I looked at the man, my breath still coming in short bursts. "I'll find a way out," I said, my voice firm, though the fear still gripped me. "I won't let it win." The man gave me a sad smile, one that spoke of years of struggle and pain. "Then you'll have to be stronger than the forest. But remember, once you leave, the forest will never leave you." With that, he turned and walked into the shadows, disappearing as if he had never been there. The darkness swallowed him whole, and the forest around me seemed to exhale, as if the curse had taken one last breath before allowing me to go. I didn't wait to look back. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the earth beneath me as I raced for the clearing, hoping, praying that the forest wouldn't change its mind and claim me once more. The days that followed were some of the most difficult of my life. Even though I had made it out of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, just beyond the veil of reality. The memories haunted me, creeping into my thoughts at night, when the world around me fell quiet. In the moments between sleep and wakefulness, when the darkness was thick and my mind wandered, I could still hear it. The subtle rustling of leaves, the soft crackle of twigs breaking, the weight of something unseen following me, waiting. I couldn't escape it, not entirely. The world outside the forest seemed unchanged, as if I had stepped back into a life that had continued without me. But everything felt different. It was like I was living in a world that didn't quite match the one I had known. The hum of the city, the noise of everyday life, it all felt hollow, distant. The forest had marked me, branded me in a way that no one could see, no one could understand. And no matter how far I ran, the shadows seemed to follow, always lurking at the edge of my consciousness. I tried to push it out of my mind. I tried to go back to my routine, to pretend that nothing had happened, but the weight of that experience was too heavy to ignore. The encounter with the figure in the forest, the eerie feeling that something was always watching, it was as though the forest had seeped into me, into my very soul, and there was no washing it away. At night, I would lie awake in bed, listening to the sounds of the world outside my window. The wind rustling through the trees, the occasional owl calling from the distance, sounds that should have been comforting, but instead felt like reminders that the forest was never truly gone. I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond my reach. I thought I was going crazy. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see it. The twisted trees, the dark figures standing in the shadows, the unsettling silence that had fallen over the forest. The man I had met, the one who had tried to warn me, his words echoed in my mind. "Once you leave, the forest will never leave you." And he was right. I tried to talk to people, to explain what had happened, but they couldn't understand. They listened, but their eyes would glaze over as I spoke. They would nod politely and change the subject, as though I had simply imagined it all. But I knew what I had experienced. I knew what had happened to me. I had felt the forest close in around me, had felt the cold breath of something ancient and powerful at my back. No one could take that from me. Months passed, and life went on. But every so often, I would find myself in a moment of stillness, when the world quieted down and my thoughts wandered back to that cursed place. I would feel the chill crawl up my spine, the unease settle in my gut, and I would remember. It was during one of those moments, a year after my escape from the forest, that I found myself standing at the edge of the woods once more. I had told myself I wouldn't return. I had sworn that I was done with it, that the forest was a part of my past that I would leave behind. But the memories, the feeling, the constant pull, it had never left me. And so, here I was, standing in front of the trees that had almost claimed my life, the place that had haunted my every thought. The wind was still, the air heavy with the weight of the world, but it felt different this time. There was a strange calm that washed over me, like the forest was waiting, watching, as it had always done. The figure was no longer just a shadow in my mind. It was real, tangible, and I knew that I couldn't escape it unless I faced it head on. I stepped forward, feeling the crunch of the dry leaves beneath my boots. The forest seemed to inhale as I approached, as though it recognized me, acknowledging my return. It was as if I had never left. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The lantern. It was glowing softly in the twilight, its faint light flickering like the last breath of something alive. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but I didn't stop. I walked toward it, my feet heavy with each step, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I had to know. I had to understand why this place had such a hold on me. When I reached the lantern, I stopped. There was no figure, no dark presence standing by it this time. Just the stillness of the forest, the quiet hum of something ancient and powerful beneath the surface. I reached out and touched the lantern, my fingers brushing against the cool metal. The moment I did, a wave of cold washed over me, and I felt the weight of the forest pressing in on me once more. And then, as if in response, the darkness seemed to pulse, to come alive. The trees shifted, their branches creaking as though they were stretching toward me, their shadows twisting in the dim light. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't running. I had come to understand something in all the time I had spent trying to forget. The forest wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a collection of trees and spirits and shadows. It was a part of me now, a part that I could never shake, no matter how hard I tried. And maybe, just maybe, that was the lesson I needed to learn. The forest was alive, yes, but it wasn't just out there. It was in me, in my fear, my memories, my regrets. It had claimed me, not because it was evil, but because it was a reflection of the darkness that existed in all of us. The fear we carry, the grief we bury, the things we cannot let go of. And so, I stood there in the silence, the lantern glowing softly at my side, knowing that this would never truly end. The forest would always be with me, just as I would always be with it. I turned, walking away from the lantern, from the place I had once feared so deeply. The forest faded behind me, its shadows growing long in the distance. I had made peace with it, in my own way. It had claimed a part of me, but it had also given me something, an understanding of the darkness that we all carry. And so, I left the forest behind once more, not in fear, but in quiet acceptance. The forest had taught me that sometimes, the only way to truly escape is to stop running. It all started a few years ago when I decided to take a spontaneous road trip with a few friends. We were looking for an escape from our hectic lives, something to break the monotony of work, school, and the usual routine that had been consuming our everyday. The idea was simple: pack up the car, drive through the night, and find a cozy, quiet hotel to rest before heading back. A quick getaway, nothing more, nothing less. We were driving along a long stretch of highway, the kind of route where the only sounds that could be heard were the tires of the car against the pavement and the occasional hum of the radio in the background. The weather was perfect for a trip like this. Clear skies, a slight breeze, and the coolness of the evening creeping in as the sun began to set. Everything felt calm, peaceful, a true escape from everything else. After a few hours on the road, we came across a small town, the kind you only notice if you're actively looking for it. The buildings looked old, but charming in their own way, with streetlights casting a warm glow across the sidewalks. It was here that we decided to stop for the night. We spotted a small, vintage hotel at the end of the road, nothing too flashy, but something about it stood out. The place had character. The sign was dimly lit, barely visible, but the name of the hotel, the Old Oak Inn, seemed inviting enough. We pulled into the parking lot, which was almost empty save for a few cars scattered across the space. It was late, and we knew that the front desk would likely be closing soon, so we rushed inside to check in. The lobby was quiet, and the air inside had that slightly musty, aged scent that made you feel like you'd stepped back in time. The floors were wooden, creaking under our weight as we moved. Behind the front desk stood an older man, probably in his late 60s, who greeted us with a weary smile. His face was weathered, his eyes tired, but there was something strangely comforting about him. He handed us the keys to our room, room 217, and we made our way up the narrow staircase. Our room was small, but it had everything we needed: 2 beds, a small table, and a bathroom that looked as though it hadn't been updated in decades. The wallpaper was peeling at the edges, and the dim lighting gave the room a slightly eerie feel, but nothing that was out of the ordinary for a place of this age. We joked about how it felt like we'd stepped into a scene from an old mystery novel, but none of us thought much of it. We were all just ready to rest. As I sat on one of the beds, I looked around the room. The furniture was old but sturdy, and there was a strange painting on the wall, an image of a man standing in front of a large, gnarled tree, his face obscured by shadows. The eyes of the man in the painting seemed to follow me, no matter where I moved in the room. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a coincidence. My friends and I started chatting, and before we knew it, the time had passed, and we were all getting ready for bed. I didn't think much about it, but that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was like a constant weight on my chest, nothing concrete, just a general unease that kept me awake long after the others had fallen asleep. The room felt too quiet, too still. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but inside, there was an almost suffocating silence. My friends snored lightly, their breathing soft and rhythmic, but my mind kept racing. Something in the room felt off, like we were being watched. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the feeling lingered. I turned over in bed, staring at the ceiling. The faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the room only added to the tension. I glanced over at my friends. They were sound asleep. I tried to relax, but the unease in my chest refused to fade. I thought of getting up to get some water, maybe even stepping outside for a breath of fresh air, but something stopped me. It was almost like an invisible force holding me in place. So I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. And yet, something wasn't right. That much I was sure of. The clock ticked on, the night stretched out before me, and the weight in the room grew heavier. The night had settled in like a heavy blanket, wrapping around us in a tight grip. I kept trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that the unease I felt was just the result of too many horror movies and late-night stories. But as the minutes ticked by, the feeling only grew stronger. I found myself staring at the walls, my thoughts swirling, my body tense. It was then that I heard it, a soft sound, almost imperceptible at first. A faint scratching noise, like something, or someone, dragging across the floor. I blinked, wondering if it was just the old building settling, or a part of the night silence playing tricks on me. But the sound grew louder. It was coming from the corner of the room, the one near the small dresser. I sat up in bed, my heart beginning to race. I looked over at my friends. They were still asleep, their quiet breathing the only sound filling the room. I turned my attention back to the corner, straining my ears. The noise continued, faint but undeniable. Scratching, like nails running across wood. I held my breath, hoping that it would stop, that it would simply fade away and I could go back to sleep. But it didn't. In fact, the sound seemed to grow more distinct, more purposeful. I reached over to the nightstand and grabbed my phone, checking the time. It was well past 2 a.m. The air in the room felt colder now, the chill creeping over my skin. I tried to shake off the fear settling in the pit of my stomach. It was probably just a rat or some old pipes making noise. That's all it was, I convinced myself. But even as I thought that, I couldn't bring myself to look away from the corner. The scratching continued for what felt like an eternity, growing more rhythmic. It was as though whatever was causing the sound was pacing, waiting for something. I could feel my palms start to sweat, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. It was then that I saw it. Something moved. In the corner, near the dresser, the shadows shifted. The shape of something long and thin, like a limb or a claw, seemed to extend from the darkness, stretching slowly toward the light. My breath caught in my throat, my eyes wide in disbelief. I blinked, trying to clear the image from my mind, but the shape remained. It didn't make sense, and yet there it was, as if the room itself was alive and breathing, shifting in ways it shouldn't. I slowly shifted in bed, not wanting to disturb my friends, but feeling the need to escape the growing tension in the room. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I managed to inch my way to the edge of the bed, trying to keep my movements quiet. The scratching sound had stopped, but the room still felt wrong. The weight of something unseen pressed against my chest, suffocating me with every breath. I glanced at my friends. They were still deep in sleep, unaffected by whatever strange thing was happening around us. I envied their peace. It felt as though the room was in a different reality altogether, one where I was the only one who could sense the subtle disturbances. My mind raced as I tried to reason with myself. Surely, it was just an old hotel with creaky floors, old pipes, and the normal sounds of a building that had been standing for decades. But something told me that I was wrong. Something felt much more sinister. I turned my attention back to the corner. The shape I had seen was gone, but I wasn't fooled. I could still feel the presence, like a weight pressing against me. I slowly leaned back, my eyes glued to that spot, waiting for it to reappear. The seconds stretched into minutes. I felt the coldness in the room seep deeper into my bones, but no sound followed. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity and fear got the better of me. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and walked toward the corner of the room. I didn't want to wake my friends, but I needed to know what was going on. My hand hovered near the dresser, unsure of what to do next. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as though something unseen was hanging in the atmosphere. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the handle of the dresser and slowly pulled it open, half expecting to find nothing at all. The drawers were empty, except for a few sheets of paper that looked old and yellowed, some dust collecting in the corners. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickly shut the drawer, breathing a sigh of relief. There was nothing there. Maybe it was just my imagination after all. But as I stepped back, I felt it a slight shift in the air, a subtle pressure, like someone standing behind me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned around, fully expecting to see something standing there, waiting. But the room was still. The air still thick, but no sign of anything unusual. I tried to shake off the fear that was beginning to take hold, telling myself it was just nerves, that I was overthinking everything. But as I turned back to my bed, my phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the floor, breaking the silence with an unnatural sharpness. It was then that I saw it, just out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving across the wall. A figure, tall and elongated, moving with a purpose. The shadow wasn't mine, nor was it my friend. It seemed to have no shape, no form other than its silhouette against the faint light coming from the window. I quickly grabbed my phone from the floor and snapped on the flashlight. The beam of light swept across the room, and for a brief moment, everything seemed normal. The dresser, the beds, the walls. But as the light passed over the wall, it flickered for a split second, and when it did, the shadow was gone. No trace, no sign of its existence other than the lingering unease I felt in my bones. I stood there in the middle of the room, heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to call out to my friends, wake them up, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't explain what had just happened. How could I? Instead, I stood there, paralyzed by the fear of the unknown, unsure of what I had just witnessed. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. I had seen the shadow, hadn't I? It wasn't just a trick of the light, not a product of my imagination. But what was it? And why was it in this room? These questions swirled in my mind, but there were no answers. Not yet, at least. I slowly returned to my bed, too shaken to sleep, but too exhausted to stay awake any longer. My body ached from the tension, but somehow I managed to close my eyes, my thoughts still racing, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that room was waiting, watching. And I couldn't help but wonder if I was going to find out exactly what it was in the hours to come. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The coldness in the room never fully dissipated, and every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the curtains seemed louder, more pronounced. I couldn't escape the lingering sensation that the air itself was heavier than before, pressing against my chest with an invisible weight. As the morning light began to creep through the window, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. My mind replayed the events of the night, trying to make sense of it all. I had convinced myself that it was nothing more than a bad dream or the result of the hotel's old age, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. Something had happened, something that couldn't be easily explained. I glanced over at my friends, who were still sound asleep. They hadn't heard a thing. They hadn't felt the oppressive atmosphere or seen the shadow on the wall. It was as if they were living in a completely different world, one where everything was perfectly normal. I envied their ability to sleep so soundly, their ability to shut off the world around them. As the morning wore on, I tried to shake off the sense of dread that clung to me. But every time I looked at the dresser or the corner where the shadow had appeared, my heart would skip a beat. I couldn't help but keep expecting it to happen again. The strange events, the shadows, the noises, they were still fresh in my mind, like a haunting echo I couldn't escape. By the time the sun had fully risen, the unsettling feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it had intensified. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier. I was hyper-aware of every sound, the rustling of leaves outside the window, the distant hum of traffic, even the soft tap of my own breathing. It was as if the world had slowed down, every detail magnified in its significance. But the strangest part was that, despite everything, nothing unusual had happened. Yet, I went to the bathroom to wash my face, hoping the cool water would clear my head. The mirror reflected my tired face, eyes heavy from lack of sleep. As I splashed water onto my face, I felt the chill in the air intensify, like a draft brushing across my skin. I froze, wiping my face dry. The room was still, the bathroom silent, yet the cold seemed to have come from nowhere. Suddenly, I heard it again. A soft scraping sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from the hallway, just outside the bathroom door. I turned quickly, expecting to see one of my friends, but the hallway was empty. My heart began to race as I listened intently, the sound growing louder, closer, like something or someone was pacing just outside. I stepped cautiously into the hallway, peering into the dim light that filtered in from the windows. The air felt even colder out here, the chills seeping into my bones. I glanced down at the floor, half expecting to see something, anything out of place. But there was nothing. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the old wooden floor, the silence around me almost suffocating. The scraping noise was still there, a subtle sound that seemed to shift locations, moving from one end of the hallway to the other. It was as though the sound was following me, always just out of sight, never fully revealing its source. I reached the end of the hallway, where a small door led to a stairwell that spiraled down to the lower levels. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond inviting yet ominous. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open, my hand trembling slightly. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder with every step. The building seemed to stretch down, deeper into the earth, and the silence felt oppressive, as though the walls were closing in around me. I reached the bottom and found myself in a dimly lit basement, the kind of place where old furniture and forgotten memories were left to gather dust. As I moved deeper into the basement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me through the shadows. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the eerie nature of the place, but the feeling was so strong that I couldn't ignore it. I reached for my phone, flicking on the flashlight, and scanned the room. The beam of light illuminated piles of old boxes, broken furniture, and dust-covered tools. But as the light moved across the room, it flickered for a moment. And when it came back on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the room, near a broken window, stood a figure. A shadowy, indistinct shape, like a person, but not quite. It was too tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and it seemed to flicker in and out of existence as though it were not fully there. My heart pounded in my chest as I froze, unable to move or look away. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, like a weight pressing against me. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, an unnatural force that seemed to be pulling me in. I stepped back, my breath shallow, the beam of light still aimed at the figure. I blinked, hoping that it would disappear, that it was just a trick of the light or my imagination. But it didn't. It stayed there, just beyond the edge of the light, its shape wavering in and out of focus. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and fled up the stairs, my feet stumbling over the worn steps as I rushed back to the safety of the hallway. I burst through the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that basement wasn't something I wanted to confront. I made my way back to the room, my mind racing, and found my friend sitting up in bed, looking at me with concern. "What's wrong?" one of them asked, her voice soft and groggy. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain what I had just seen? How could I tell them that I had just encountered something I couldn't even begin to understand? I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself, but I knew I couldn't keep this to myself much longer. The strange events were happening more frequently now. The noises, the shadows, the feeling of being watched, it was all becoming too much. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that basement, whatever was following me, was only getting started. I didn't know what it wanted, or why it had chosen this hotel, but I knew one thing: it wasn't something I could ignore anymore. Something was happening, and I was caught right in the middle of it. The next few hours felt like a blur. My friends were beginning to notice that something wasn't right. My nerves were on edge, my eyes constantly darting toward corners, windows, and shadows that seemed to shift as though they had a mind of their own. I tried to act normal, tried to push everything to the back of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slowly creeping closer. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The housekeeper who had been assigned to our floor had long since gone, and the front desk was closed. But I had to do something. Whatever was in this hotel wasn't something I could just ignore. I told my friends I was going to check the basement again, and they tried to stop me, claiming I was overthinking everything. But I couldn't just sit there. I had to go back down. The feeling of dread had reached a point where it was suffocating, and I had to confront it. The moment I stepped out of the room and into the hallway, the air grew thick with an almost electric tension. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I took a deep breath and walked to the door that led to the basement, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open on its own, as though it had been waiting for me. The basement was colder than before. The temperature seemed to drop the moment I entered, a biting cold that numbed my fingers and made my breath visible in the dim light. My flashlight flickered on again, but this time the beam was less stable, as though the power was fluctuating. I moved slowly, cautiously, aware of every noise and every shadow around me. It felt as though the walls were closing in, the space narrowing with every step I took. But the worst part, the oppressive silence. It was absolute, broken only by the soft sound of my breathing, which seemed to echo through the basement like a distant drumbeat. Suddenly, I heard it again, the scraping sound, faint but unmistakable. It was closer now, so much closer. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I pointed the flashlight toward the source of the noise, and there, in the farthest corner of the room, I saw it. The figure. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was solid, more real than anything I had ever seen. A tall, dark figure that seemed to absorb the light around it, standing still like a statue. I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. Then, without warning, it moved. I could hear the scraping sound again, this time louder, as though it was dragging something heavy across the floor. The figure didn't walk, it glided, floating just above the ground, its head slowly turning toward me. The face. There was no face. Just a smooth, featureless expanse of blackness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was constricted, my voice stolen by fear. The figure raised one of its long, spindly arms and pointed directly at me. It was an unnatural movement, the arm extending impossibly long, like a creature with too many joints. I could feel its gaze, even though it had no eyes. It was as if it was searching inside me, reaching for something deep within, something I couldn't escape. Suddenly, the figure let out a low, guttural sound. It wasn't a voice, but more like a vibration, a hum that rattled my bones. The air grew heavier, thick with an energy I couldn't understand. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The scraping sound stopped, the cold faded, and the basement was silent once more. But I wasn't alone. Behind me, in the shadows, I heard a whisper. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with every passing second, the voice of a person, someone, calling my name. The sound was familiar, too familiar, but I couldn't place it. I turned, slowly, afraid of what I would see. And there, standing just outside the beam of my flashlight, was someone I thought I would never see again. It was a face I hadn't seen in years. A face I had tried so hard to forget. It was the face of someone who had died. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure smiled, or at least, it looked like it was smiling. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to peer directly into my soul. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. My mind was racing, my heart beating in my throat as I stumbled through the darkened basement, desperate to escape. The figure's voice echoed in my ears, getting louder with each step, calling my name, demanding that I stop, that I face it. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I burst through the basement door and slammed it shut behind me, my hands shaking as I leaned against it, gasping for breath. I was back in the hallway, the familiar surroundings offering no comfort, no sense of safety. As I reached the hallway, still panting from my desperate sprint away from the basement, I felt the oppressive weight of the hotel pressing in on me. The air had returned to its familiar stale smell, but the terror lingered like a heavy fog. I had seen something that no one could explain. My mind raced with questions, with fear, with doubt. What had just happened? What was that thing? I stumbled down the hallway, not really seeing where I was going, my thoughts consumed with the vision of the dark figure and the voice I had heard. The dead face. My friend's face. It wasn't just some hallucination or trick of the mind. No, this was something real. Too real. The hotel, the basement, the figure. I knew deep down that they were connected. But what had it all meant? Was I supposed to be there? Was this a warning or something worse? I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around, heart racing. No one was there. The hallway was empty. I looked up to the old clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. Time felt distorted. It had only been hours since it first checked into this place, but it felt like days had passed. Had it all really happened in such a short time? Could I trust my own mind? Was I losing touch with reality? The silence around me was suffocating. I wasn't sure where to go or what to do. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't stay in that room any longer, not with the image of that dark figure and the dead face still burned into my memory. But I couldn't leave either. Something told me I needed to stay, to face whatever had been awakened in that basement. I walked back toward the elevator, my hand trembling as I pressed the button to call it down. My reflection in the brass doors seemed foreign, my face pale, eyes wide, the fear still evident. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Without thinking, I stepped inside. The doors closed behind me with a heavy sound, like a final lock on a prison cell. As the elevator descended, the lights flickered. The familiar hum of the machinery seemed distant, muffled, as though the elevator was being pulled into something much darker below. I gripped the railing tightly, feeling the sudden drop in temperature again, like a cold gust of wind brushing past my face. The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened to a dimly lit lobby. The front desk clerk was gone. The lobby was eerily quiet, like the building was holding its breath once again. I walked out onto the street, the cool night air hitting my face, but the chill from the basement still clung to me. I glanced around, half expecting to see the same haunting figure lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. No sign of anything unusual. Just the quiet hum of the city around me. I don't know why I didn't leave right away. Perhaps it was a sense of duty, a need to understand what had happened. Or maybe, deep down, I didn't think the hotel was finished with me. I knew the darkness would follow me, no matter where I went. I had to finish what had started. I walked back toward the entrance. The lights overhead flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the floor. The lobby was deserted, save for a tall, thin man sitting in one of the plush chairs by the window. He seemed out of place, his face obscured by the darkness. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice raspy. I froze, my pulse quickening. His words cut through the stillness, breaking the silence of the night. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to leave, but my feet felt glued to the floor. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. He smiled faintly, a grim, knowing expression on his face. "You've been down there, haven't you?" My throat tightened. "How do you know?" He chuckled, but it wasn't a comforting sound. It was dark and full of an unsettling familiarity. "I've been here longer than you can imagine. Seen things, felt things. Just like you." "What's happening here?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The man leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine with a sharp intensity. "You're not the first to come looking for answers. Many have stayed here before you, and many will come after. This place doesn't let go easily. It has a way of keeping people." His voice trailed off, almost as if the words were too dangerous to speak aloud. I took a step back, my mind racing. I had to leave. Now, before whatever had attached itself to me could grow stronger. The man reached out, his bony hand brushing against my arm. His grip was icy. "It's already too late." I pulled away, running out of the lobby into the cold night air. My mind was reeling, but there was one thing I knew for sure. I couldn't stay in that hotel. Not anymore. I didn't care what the man had said or how much I needed answers. My safety was more important. I grabbed my phone from my pocket, dialing a cab. I needed to leave this city, this hotel, this nightmare behind. It didn't matter where I went, as long as it was far from that place. But even as I stepped into the cab, even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly free. The hotel, the figure, the whispers, everything from that night was still with me, lingering just out of reach. And I had no idea when or how that would happen. The city's lights blurred into streaks as the cab drove through the night, taking me farther and farther from the hotel. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, trailing behind, just out of sight. A part of me wondered if I had made a mistake by leaving. Maybe I should have stayed. Maybe the answers I was looking for were still waiting there. But another part of me, the part that was still trembling from the memories of that basement, knew I could never go back. The hotel had changed me. It had made me see things, things I couldn't explain, things that weren't supposed to exist. But as the taxi sped down the empty streets, I began to realize something. The hotel wasn't just a place. It wasn't just an old building with a sinister past. It was something much darker, something alive, something that fed on the fear of those who dared to enter. And now, it had me. I spent the next few weeks trying to put the experience behind me. I tried to tell myself that it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind. But the truth was, I couldn't forget. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark figure again, that twisted face staring at me from the shadows. The whispers, those faint, haunting whispers, still echoed in my ears. I tried to move on with my life, but it wasn't easy. The feeling of dread, of being watched, lingered with me like a second skin. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was always just around the corner, waiting for me. I began to doubt my own sanity. Was I imagining things? Was the hotel really haunted, or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I reached out to people who had stayed at the hotel before, hoping for some sort of explanation. But each person I spoke to gave me the same vague responses, as though they were all too afraid to speak openly about their experiences. Some said they had felt uneasy during their stay, but they dismissed it as nothing more than an overactive imagination. Others wouldn't speak of it at all, as if mentioning the hotel brought back something they couldn't bear to remember. I thought about going back to confront whatever was waiting there, to find answers once and for all. But I couldn't. I knew it was too dangerous. The hotel had made its mark on me, and I had no idea how to erase it. So I did the only thing I could think of. I moved far away. To a new city, a new life. I hoped that distance would help me forget. But even as I started over, I couldn't outrun the memories. They crept into my dreams, twisted my thoughts, and haunted me with every passing day. I began to feel like I was being pulled back to that hotel, as if some invisible force was dragging me toward it. The more I tried to escape, the stronger the pull became. And then, one night, something happened. I was sitting in my new apartment, flipping through old photographs, when I came across a picture of the hotel. The old, decaying building looked so familiar, so ordinary in the photo. But the moment I looked at it, I felt that same chilling sensation wash over me. That same suffocating dread. I set the picture down quickly, my hands trembling. I didn't want to think about it anymore. But just as I was about to push the image away, I heard a faint sound. A whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was there, just like it had been in the hotel, just like it had been in the basement. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, looking around the apartment. There was nothing. No one. But the whisper, it was real. It was the same voice I had heard in the basement, the same voice that had taunted me with its sinister words. I rushed to the door, unlocking it and stepping out into the hallway. The building was eerily quiet. No one was around, just the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. But something didn't feel right. Something was wrong. I could feel it. The hotel was calling me back. That night, I made a decision. I had to go back. Not because I wanted answers, but because I had no choice. Whatever was happening, whatever had followed me from that hotel, wasn't going to let me go until I confronted it head on. It was as if the hotel had left a piece of itself inside me, and it was never going to let go until it had everything. The next morning, I booked a flight. I knew it was dangerous, but I couldn't ignore the pull anymore. I was going back to the hotel. I didn't know what would happen when I got there, but I knew one thing for sure. This time, I was going to face whatever was waiting for me. The day I arrived, I stood in front of the hotel again. It looked the same, old, decrepit, and haunting. But this time, I wasn't afraid. The fear had turned into something else. Something darker. Something that felt almost like a promise. I walked through the lobby. past the receptionist, who seemed to recognize me but didn't say a word. The elevator doors opened as if they were waiting for me, as if they had been waiting for my return. I stepped inside, feeling the weight of the building pressing down on me once more. The elevator descended. The lights flickered. I knew where I was going. I arrived at the basement once more. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the darkness swallowing me whole. But this time, I wasn't alone. The figure was there, standing at the end of the hallway, just like it had been before. And this time, I walked toward it. It was late in the evening when I first stepped into that hospital, a building that had been part of my everyday life for months. I wasn't there for anything too dramatic, just routine. But something about the place seemed off, even though no one would say it out loud. It was one of those things you can feel deep in your gut, but no one acknowledges. This story takes place in a small town, not far from where I live, a town where the hospital had been around for decades. A place where life and death seem to come and go with the seasons, and no one thinks twice about it. It'd been there enough times to know the creaks and groans of the old building, the soft hum of the machines, and the sterile smell that clung to everything. It wasn't a place you would typically call welcoming, but it was familiar. Nothing really stood out until that night. It was the middle of the week, and I was on a night shift in the hospital's emergency department. I was just another face among the nurses, doctors, and patients, each wrapped up in their own little worlds. It wasn't my first shift, but it felt different. Maybe it was the rain outside that night, the way it hammered against the windows, or maybe it was the unsettling silence that filled the halls. But it wasn't just the weather that made me uneasy. There was something else, something lingering in the air that I couldn't quite place. The night began like any other. I walked through the fluorescent-lit hallways of the hospital, checked on patients, and helped out where needed. The smell of antiseptic filled my nostrils as I passed the sterile rooms. Each room was a scene of its own, quiet, a little clinical, a little detached from reality. But there was one room on the 4th floor that caught my attention. Room 412. I had never really noticed it before, but as I passed, I glanced over and saw that the door was slightly ajar. It wasn't unusual for rooms to be empty or for doors to be left open, especially during the late hours when staff were busy and patients often slept through the night. But something about this particular room felt different. It felt like it was waiting for me. Or maybe I was just tired and my imagination was running wild. I shrugged it off, as I had many other strange feelings that night. After all, hospitals are filled with oddities, both real and imagined. As I continued my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept walking past room 412, each time with a glance, as if I couldn't quite ignore it. And each time, it felt like the door was a little wider. That's when I first heard a faint sound, like the soft shuffle of feet on the linoleum floor. At first, I thought it was just another nurse, or maybe a patient wandering in the night. But as I turned the corner, I realized there was no one there. The hallway was empty. Still, the sound lingered. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing, just my tired mind playing tricks. The night wore on, and my shift stretched longer than usual. The hospital, like always, felt both alive and eerily quiet at the same time. The overhead lights hummed. The occasional beep of a heart monitor could be heard from distant rooms, and the smell of disinfectant was ever present. But when I reached room 412 again, something felt different. The door was wide open now, and I could see a shadow moving inside, a silhouette against the pale light from the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I was certain I had passed this room a few minutes ago, and it had been empty. The door had been closed, but now it was open, and I could see someone inside. I approached slowly, my footsteps barely making a sound on the smooth floor. As I peered inside, I saw nothing but the empty bed, the white sheet still neat and undisturbed. But there, in the corner, stood a figure. A person, their back to me, seemingly staring out the window. The window was closed, and I knew the figure couldn't have come from there. But they stood still, motionless, almost as if frozen in time. "Hello," I called out softly, unsure of what I was seeing. The figure didn't respond. They didn't even move. It was as if they didn't hear me, or they simply didn't care. I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with a sense of unease. There was something wrong about the figure, something I couldn't put my finger on. I was just about to speak again when the person turned around quickly, their face hidden in the shadows. I froze, unsure whether to stay or leave. Something told me I wasn't supposed to be there, that I had stepped into a space I wasn't meant to enter. And in that moment, I decided to leave. I quickly stepped back, closing the door softly behind me. As I walked away, my heart raced. It wasn't just the figure that unsettled me. It was the feeling of being watched, of being drawn into something I didn't understand. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. No one would believe me, and I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But from that night forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I thought about room 412 often, wondering who or what was there. But I pushed it to the back of my mind, focusing on the usual work of the hospital. Still, whenever I passed that room, I couldn't help but glance over, and each time I would see the door ajar, just a little more. The unsettling feeling never went away. It only grew stronger until I was certain something was watching me from within that room. The day after my strange encounter with room 412, things seemed to return to normal, at least on the surface. I went about my shift with the same routine, checking on patients, assisting the nurses, and making sure everything was running smoothly. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That feeling grew stronger as the day went on, and soon I found myself dreading the inevitable return to the fourth floor. By the time my break came around, I found myself in the small break room with a cup of coffee in my hand, trying to calm my nerves. I looked around at the others in the room, my coworkers chatting and laughing, none of them seeming to notice how tense the atmosphere had become for me. I couldn't explain why, but everything felt wrong. Even the usual hum of the overhead lights felt too loud, too intrusive. I tried to focus on the conversation going on around me, but my mind kept drifting back to room 412. The figure standing in the corner of the room, unmoving, silent. Something about it made my skin crawl. But I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a product of the stress and fatigue. It'd been working long hours recently, and my exhaustion was starting to show. Maybe I was just imagining things. That afternoon, I returned to my shift, determined to focus on the task at hand. The hospital was busier than usual, But that didn't distract me from the uneasy feeling that still lingered. When I walked past room 412 again, I couldn't help but glance inside. The door was open, just like the night before, but this time there was no shadow, no figure standing by the window. The room was empty, just like I had hoped. But as I turned away to continue down the hall, I heard a soft sound, almost like a faint tapping. It was barely audible, but it was there, coming from inside the room. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks. The sound was rhythmic, like something or someone was tapping against the walls or the bed frame. My first instinct was to ignore it, to tell myself it was just the sound of something settling in the room. The building was old, after all, and it creaked and groaned in ways that could easily be mistaken for something more sinister. I was about to walk away when the tapping stopped. Dead silence followed, and I froze, my body tense. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I felt a cold chill creep up my spine, but I forced myself to take a step forward towards the open door. As I peered inside, I saw nothing unusual. The room was exactly as it had been the night before, empty, still, and quiet. But the unease inside me refused to go away. I stood there for a moment longer, staring at the room, before I quickly stepped back and walked away. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't normal. Later that night, I found myself in the break room again, but this time I wasn't alone. Two nurses, Ava and Rachel, sat at the table, talking quietly. I sat down with them, but my mind kept drifting to room 412, wondering if the tapping sound had been real or just a product of my overactive imagination. The unease hadn't left me, and it was starting to feel like something was watching me. "Hey, have you guys noticed anything strange on the 4th floor lately?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Ava glanced up, her brow furrowed. "Strange? Like what?" "I don't know," I replied, trying to put my thoughts into words. "It's just, I've been feeling weird, like something's off. I swear I heard something last night, tapping, like something was in room 412. Rachel frowned. "You're talking about the old room, right? I heard it's been empty for weeks." I nodded. "Yeah, that's the one." "I wouldn't worry about it too much," Ava said, shaking her head. "The building makes all sorts of noises. It's probably just the wind or pipes." But even as she said it, I could see the flicker of unease in her eyes. Ava had worked in the hospital for years, and she was tough. If she was even slightly uncomfortable, it was enough to make me question everything. Rachel chimed in, trying to change the subject. "Maybe you just need to get some sleep. We all hear things when we're overtired." I wanted to believe them. I wanted to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. But the feeling of dread continued to settle over me, and I couldn't ignore it. The rest of the shift passed uneventfully, but every time I walked past room 412, I couldn't help but glance inside, half expecting to see the door slightly ajar and the shadow of someone waiting. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained. I had nearly forgotten about the tapping sound, but as I was about to leave, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more persistent. The sound came from the direction of the 4th floor, and I froze in my tracks. I looked around, but no one else seemed to hear it. The hospital was eerily quiet, and I was alone in the hallway. My heart raced as I walked towards the source of the noise, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The tapping grew louder with each step I took, until it was all I could hear. When I reached the hallway outside room 412, I hesitated. The door was wide open now, the darkness inside almost swallowing the hallway light. I had a choice to make. Part of me wanted to leave, to pretend I hadn't heard anything and go home. But another part of me, the one that couldn't shake the feeling of being drawn to the room, pushed me forward. I stepped closer to the door, and the tapping stopped immediately. I stood there, my breath shallow, my hand resting against the doorframe. The room inside was dark, but I could just make out the faint outline of the bed. Nothing else. No movement. no figure standing in the corner. But as I took another step forward, I saw it. A small, white object was lying on the floor next to the bed, just inside the doorway. It was a piece of paper, folded neatly, as if placed there intentionally. I reached for it hesitantly, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The paper was cold to the touch, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I unfolded it carefully, revealing the words scrawled across the page. "Leave, before it's too late." My breath caught in my throat as I stood frozen in the doorway, the paper still in my hand. I didn't wait another second. I turned and ran. The next few days felt like a blur. My mind constantly returned to room 412, replaying the events in my head over and over again. I couldn't get rid of the image of the paper it found, the warning scrawled in frantic handwriting. The words echoed in my thoughts. "Leave, before it's too late." The room seemed to be calling to me, its dark presence lingering in my peripheral vision, just out of reach. I couldn't tell anyone about it, not yet. How could I? How could I explain that I was being haunted by a hospital room? The idea sounded absurd, even to me. But every time I walked past that door, something tugged at me, a constant, low hum in my chest, urging me to look inside. The tension in my chest never left, and the quiet whispers of the hospital, normally soothing, only added to my growing sense of dread. One night, on my way home after another exhausting shift, I heard it again. The tapping. But this time, it was different. It was louder, more urgent. It seemed to come from deeper within the fourth floor. My body froze at the sound, and my heart pounded as I glanced toward the stairs that led up to the higher levels of the hospital. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there for a moment, struggling with my own nerves. But I couldn't ignore it any longer. The curiosity had grown too powerful. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but I couldn't leave without at least trying to figure out what was going on. The fourth floor was quiet when I stepped off the elevator. It always was, quiet, almost too quiet, as if it was a different world from the rest of the hospital. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across the linoleum floor. I walked down the hallway slowly, my eyes darting from door to door. When I reached room 412, I hesitated. The door was wide open, just like before. But this time, something was different. The air felt thicker, colder. The faint scent of antiseptic mixed with something else, something metallic, like old blood. It lingered in the air, making me feel lightheaded. I took a cautious step forward, then another. My fingers brushed the doorframe, and I flinched at the sensation, as if the room itself were alive, reaching out to touch me. The tapping had stopped. Everything was still, too still. The only sound was the low hum of the hospital's air conditioning. But as I stepped into the room, I noticed something. The bed, which had been neatly made before, was now unkempt, the sheets twisted and torn as though someone had been thrashing about. A cold chill ran down my spine. There was no sign of any patient, but something felt wrong, something I couldn't explain. The walls seemed to close in around me, the dim light from the hallway barely reaching into the dark corners of the room. I took a few more steps, my breath shallow. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty room. And then, there it was, the faintest movement in the corner of the room. I snapped my head around, but nothing was there. My heart raced. My hands were trembling. I had to get out. But before I could turn, I heard it again, a soft creak from the far side of the room. The bed, the sheets, it looked like someone had gotten up. I knew there was no patient here. No one was supposed to be here. I backed up slowly, my eyes scanning every corner of the room, looking for anything that could explain the strange noises. That's when I saw it, on the floor, next to the bed, was another piece of paper. My stomach twisted as I approached it, my mind racing. Was it another warning? My hand shook as I reached down to pick it up, and as soon as my fingers brushed the cold paper, I felt a sharp, icy sensation spread through me. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something else, something that seemed to invade my very skin. I unfolded the paper carefully, the room still as death. The words were similar to the ones I had found before, but this time they were even more urgent. You shouldn't be here. It's already started. Leave now. I nearly dropped the paper. The sense of fear intensified, twisting in my gut like a knot I couldn't untie. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, to run as far away as possible. But something kept me rooted to the spot. The room felt alive, pulsing with a strange energy, as if the walls were closing in on me, threatening to swallow me whole. I glanced around, looking for an escape, and that's when I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was dark, but I could make out the outline of a person, standing still and silent, their back to me. My heart leapt in my chest. Who was that? I blinked, and the figure was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the empty corner, my breath coming in short gasps. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room, even though I knew no one else was supposed to be there. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and I snapped my head around, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, the silence oppressive. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned to leave, desperate to escape the oppressive weight of the room. But as I stepped out into the hallway, I heard it again. The soft tapping. It was coming from inside the room, as if something or someone was trying to get my attention. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help myself. I turned around slowly, and there, at the threshold of the room, was a shadow. It wasn't just any shadow, it was a figure, tall and thin, standing motionless in the doorway. Its eyes, though shadowed, seemed to pierce through me, and I felt a jolt of cold fear in my chest. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. I didn't stay to find out what had just happened. My legs were already moving before I could think, and I ran down the hallway, away from the room, away from whatever that thing was. The tapping followed me, and it wouldn't stop. The weight of the room had been dragging at me for days. It wasn't just the strange events or the unsettling presence that seemed to follow me wherever I went. It was the creeping, gnawing certainty that something was wrong, something I couldn't understand. Every moment spent in the hospital, every step taken down the sterile hallways, felt like a countdown, like I was being drawn towards something I couldn't escape. That night, something changed. I had no idea that when I walked into the hospital for my shift, I was walking into the darkest, most terrifying moment of my life. I knew something was coming. I could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just the strange noises or the fleeting images anymore. No, this time, it was different. Room 412. I had promised myself that I wouldn't go back, that I wouldn't give in to the curiosity that had pulled me toward it over and over again. But that night, when I passed by the room, something made me stop. It was like the door was calling to me, the faintest whisper of something I couldn't hear. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood frozen, my hand hovering just above the doorframe, my breath shallow. I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was in there. As if in a trance, I pushed the door open. The familiar chill hit me immediately, and the sense of wrongness intensified. It was as if the room itself was waiting for me, holding its breath. I stepped inside, and for the first time, I noticed that the room was darker than it had ever been before. The lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows that danced like restless spirits. But it wasn't just the darkness that unnerved me, it was the silence. The room had always been unnervingly quiet, but this silence felt alive, like it was suffocating me, holding me in place. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. I walked further into the room, my eyes darting around. It was still the same, empty bed, overturned chair, the sterile, unpleasant scent of antiseptic. But something felt off. The air was colder than it should have been, and I could feel a pressure building around me. tightening with every step. Then I heard a noise so faint I almost thought I imagined it, a soft, wet thud from the corner of the room. My blood ran cold. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the corner of the room, was a figure, draped in shadows, so indistinct at first that I could barely make it out. But as I looked closer, I saw it. A person, hunched over, their back turned to me. I froze. My mind raced. Was it a patient? But no one was supposed to be here. The hospital was empty. There should be no one in this room. I took a step forward, my voice catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It was as if it hadn't heard me or didn't care. I took another step, the fear mounting inside me, but my legs felt like lead. The closer I got, the more I could sense it, the presence of something cold, something wrong. I stopped just a few feet away, trying to steady my breath. The figure still didn't move, and the silence stretched on, unbearable. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the figure turned. My heart stopped. The face that looked back at me wasn't human. It was distorted, its features twisted in ways that defied explanation. The skin was a sickly gray, stretched thin over a skeletal frame. The eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were black, empty voids, like they were staring straight through me. I felt my stomach drop, my blood freezing in my veins. It wasn't just the sight of it, it was the overwhelming sense of wrongness that radiated from it. The room seemed to close in on me, suffocating me, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from that hideous, hollow face. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was as if time had stopped, the air thick with dread. Then, with a sound that I'll never forget, the person, opened its mouth, and I heard a voice, low and guttural, scraping against the edges of my mind. "You should never have come back." The words were so cold, so empty, that I felt my entire body tense up, a shock of fear shooting through my chest. I took a step back, my legs shaking beneath me, but the figure didn't move. It just watched. The words echoed in my head, over and over again, as if they were branded into my skull. "You should never have come back." Panic surged through me, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Every instinct screamed for me to run, to flee, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot by something more terrifying than fear. It was compulsion, as if the room itself had a hold on me, tightening its grip with every passing second. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Just like that, it disappeared. But I could still feel it, lurking in the corners of my mind, its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls, and I stumbled backward, gasping for air. I had to get out. But the sound of the tapping, it was louder now. Closer. The moment I stumbled out of that room, my heart was still racing, my chest heaving with every breath I took. I didn't know where to go or what to do. Everything felt like a blur. All I knew was that I couldn't go back in there. Not ever. The sound of that tapping still echoed in my head, a constant reminder of the thing I had seen, of the thing that had spoken to me. I bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the sterile, silent walls. I could feel the cold sweat on my skin, my heart still pounding like a drum in my chest. I turned corners blindly, desperate for an exit, desperate to get away from the suffocating atmosphere of the hospital. The silence was oppressive, and the air felt heavier with each passing second, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Finally, I reached the front entrance. I slammed my hand against the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in again. I could hear the tapping now, louder, closer. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to cooperate. My eyes darted around the empty lobby, searching for an escape, any escape. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, as if they were alive, as if the hospital itself was conspiring against me. Then I heard a voice, a familiar one. "Hey, are you okay?" I spun around, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. There, standing at the entrance to the lobby, was a nurse I recognized. Her name was Claire, though I hadn't spoken to her much before. She looked confused, concern etched on her face. "What? What happened?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her eyes scanning my face. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could I explain what he'd just experienced? How could I make her understand? I saw something. It was in room 412. I managed to stammer. Claire frowned. "Room 412? She repeated, her voice sounding a little more skeptical than I expected. "That's an empty room. No one's been in there for weeks. The last patient died there. I think you're probably just exhausted. It's been a long shift, hasn't it?" But her words didn't comfort me. They only made the pit in my stomach deepen. The way she said it, the way she brushed it off as if I had imagined it, made my blood run cold. "I swear to you, there was something there," I insisted, my voice shaking with the weight of what I'd seen. "I saw it. It was in that room, and it spoke to me. It told me I shouldn't have come back." Claire blinked at me, clearly unsure how to respond. I could see the doubt in her eyes, but there was something else there too, something that made her hesitate. For a split second, she looked almost worried. "You need to get some rest," she said, her voice soft. "Come on, I'll walk you out. Let's get you home, all right?" I didn't argue. The exhaustion in my bones had taken over. But even as I walked out of the building with Claire by my side, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. That I wasn't alone. That whatever I had seen in room 412 had followed me out into the world beyond those hospital walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done something I couldn't undo. I had opened a door, one that I couldn't close again. The next few days were a blur. I tried to sleep, tried to push the events of that night out of my mind, but every time I closed my eyes, the image of that twisted face would flash before me. The voice that had whispered that chilling warning, "You should never have come back," repeated in my thoughts like a broken record. I found myself avoiding the hospital. I knew I couldn't go back to room 412, not after what happened. But I also couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something unfinished, something I had left unresolved. And then, about a week later, I received an email from Claire. It was brief, just a few lines, but it made my stomach drop. "Hey, I know this might sound strange, but room 412 is back on the schedule. I don't know why or how, but they're planning to assign a new patient to it next week. I thought I'd let you know. Maybe you should check on it. Just for peace of mind." I didn't know what to think. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let it go, but something told me I couldn't. I had to know, had to find out why that room, was still in use. But when I arrived at the hospital the next morning, everything felt wrong again. There was an air of tension hanging over the place, a heaviness that settled in my chest as soon as I stepped through the doors. I tried to push it aside, telling myself I was just paranoid, but the sense of dread never left. I went straight to the floor where room 412 was located. The hallway seemed darker than usual, even though the lights overhead were on. I walked past the other rooms, but as I drew closer to room 412, my footsteps slowed. The door was open, just a crack. I could hear faint rustling inside. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door all the way open. But the room was empty. No new patient, no equipment, no sign that anyone had been there. I stood in the doorway for a moment, heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The room was exactly as I had left it, the overturned chair, the cold, sterile smell, the flickering light overhead. But nothing else. I turned to leave, the uneasy feeling still gnawing at me when I heard it. A faint sound, a tapping, from somewhere deep in the room. It's been several months since I left that place, but not a day goes by without my mind returning to the hospital, to room 412. I tried to ignore it, to bury it under the weight of daily life. But I can feel it, that thing, creeping into my thoughts like a shadow that never leaves. I don't know what I saw that night or what happened in that room. What I do know is that I'm not the same person I was before. I can't be. The memory of the tapping, the sensation of being watched, the eyes that looked right through me, it haunts me in ways I can't explain. I've tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind, that exhaustion, stress, and fear had all played their parts in distorting reality. But deep down, I know it was something more. Something that couldn't be dismissed so easily. I've never gone back to that hospital, not even once, and I doubt I ever will. I've heard rumors that room 412 was locked off, that no one is allowed to enter it anymore. Part of me wonders if it's just a story, but the other part, the part that knows what I saw, can't help but feel relieved. But I can't forget what happened. I can't forget the way the air in that room had felt so heavy, so thick with something that wasn't just air. Something alive, maybe. And the whisper, no, the voice, that told me I shouldn't have come back. The way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, taking on shapes I couldn't fully comprehend. It's all etched into my memory, like a scar that refuses to heal. And now, every time I walk past an old building or drive by a place that feels too quiet, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The tapping still echoes in my mind, like it's waiting to return, like it's waiting for me to make the mistake of going back to that room. The worst part, I know that whatever I saw that night, whatever was in that room, didn't just disappear when I left. It didn't vanish into thin air. It's out there somewhere, and it's waiting. I can't escape the feeling that, somehow, it's still following me, watching, waiting for the moment when I slip up and return to face it again. I try to tell myself that it was all in my head, that I'm just letting my fear get the best of me. But then I remember the look in Claire's eyes when she spoke about the room. The way she hesitated, just for a moment, when I mentioned what had happened. And the way the hospital seemed to shift after I left, like it was trying to erase the memory of that night. I don't know if it'll ever truly understand what happened in room 412. Maybe it's something that can't be explained. Maybe it's something that's always been there, hiding in the walls, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. Or maybe it's something that I was never meant to know in the first place. All I know for sure is that I'll never forget, and it'll never return. It was late autumn when I found myself on the isolated coast of a small, craggy island, known for its jagged cliffs and infamous lighthouse. The island was the kind of place where people often whispered about strange occurrences, but no one dared stay long enough to find out for themselves. The lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, left to decay in the salty air, its beam no longer cutting through the night, its walls now covered with the marks of time and weather. I had come to the island as part of my work, just a regular assignment to photograph the ruins and take notes on the island's history. It was supposed to be straightforward, a typical job that would fill up a couple of days, and it'd be back home before long. It heard the rumors, of course, the stories of strange noises, flickering lights, and shadows that danced across the windows, but I brushed them off. After all, I was a man of reason. I didn't believe in ghosts or things that went bump in the night. My mind was focused on the task at hand, and that was to capture the haunting beauty of a forgotten structure. When I arrived, the air was thick with the salty tang of the ocean, and the wind howled in from the vast, empty sea. I had rented a small cottage near the shore, a stone's throw away from the lighthouse. The cottage was simple, made of weathered wood and stone, but it was cozy and perfect for what I needed. The first night was calm, too calm perhaps. I spent my time sorting through equipment, checking my camera gear, and reading the history of the lighthouse from the old books I had brought along. It felt like a normal day at work. The island was a quiet place. There were no bustling shops, no crowded streets, just the relentless sound of waves crashing against the rocks and the occasional cry of seagulls. Most of the day was spent hiking around, photographing the lighthouse from different angles and exploring the small patches of forest nearby. It seemed like a perfect retreat for someone wanting to get away from the hustle of city life, and I had to admit there was a certain peacefulness in the air, a peacefulness that felt almost too perfect. The locals, when I did run into them, were quiet, reserved, and never mentioned the lighthouse unless asked directly. Their eyes seemed to gloss over when I brought it up, as though the mere mention of the structure dredged up memories they preferred to leave buried. I didn't press them for more details. After all, they weren't paying me to investigate ghost stories. One evening, as I sat by the window in the cottage, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought I saw something move on the top of the lighthouse. A fleeting figure, just a shadow that flickered in and out of view, like the light itself was playing tricks. But when I blinked and focused, there was nothing there. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, the kind of thing that happens when you're staring too long at something in the fading twilight. The nights were cold, and the wind had a bite to it, cutting through the cracks in the walls. I would often curl up under a blanket, keeping the fire burning low in the hearth. But sleep, it seemed, was a fickle companion. On the second night, I began to feel it. Something was off. There was no real reason for it, nothing concrete, just an unsettling sensation that had begun to settle into the pit of my stomach. The wind howled louder, the house creaked and groaned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I dismissed it again. It was nothing, I told myself. The sounds were just the house settling. The wind was fierce this time of year, and the island was known for its eerie isolation. But that didn't stop the chill from creeping under my skin, nor the strange, fleeting sensation that something was not quite right. It was only when I began to visit the lighthouse during the day, to photograph its decrepit beauty from up close, that I started to feel that sense of unease grow. The closer I got, the more distant I felt from the world I had left behind. It was as if the island, with its endless horizon and eerie silence, had a way of pulling you in and never letting go. I had been there less than a week, but it already felt like an eternity. And then, on the third day, something happened. Something small at first, but enough to make me start questioning everything I had known about this place. It started when I went up to the lighthouse at dusk to take a few final photographs before I left. The sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the rocks and cliffs, and the lighthouse loomed over me, taller and more imposing than ever. As I stood there, snapping a few shots of the deteriorating structure, I saw a light flicker in one of the windows, high above, just a brief, momentary flash. I thought I was imagining it, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I thought about going inside, but the door was locked tight, and the only way in was through a small, rusted hatch at the base. I didn't feel like testing my luck that day. So I packed up my things and headed back to the cottage, telling myself it was just the wind or some other natural phenomenon. But deep down, I couldn't shake the thought that something was waiting for me on that island, something I couldn't yet explain. That night, the wind picked up, stronger than ever, howling through the cracks of the cottage, and the sound of the ocean seemed closer than usual, as though the waves were pounding against the very foundation of the house. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, every creak and groan of the old structure making my nerves tighten. I told myself it was just the island, just the isolation, but as I lay there in the darkness, I knew that something was different. Something was wrong. I woke up the next morning, tired and irritable, but I forced myself to get up and go back to the lighthouse. I had to finish my job after all. The sooner I was done, the sooner I could leave this strange place behind. But when I arrived, the lighthouse seemed different. The air felt heavier, and I could swear that the structure itself seemed to loom over me more than it had before. The windows, once dark and empty, seemed to hold a secret I couldn't understand. And it was then, standing in the shadow of the lighthouse, that I realized something was waiting for me. But what was it? That was the question that would haunt me for the rest of my time on the island and beyond. The day after I stood in the shadow of the lighthouse, that feeling, an unnerving sensation, like something was pressing down on me, didn't dissipate. It followed me, settling into my bones like the chill from the ocean air. Despite telling myself it was nothing, I couldn't shake the sense that something was just off about the place. But I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let an unsettling feeling get in the way of my work. After all, there was nothing here that couldn't be explained, right? That morning, the sky was a dull gray, heavy with the promise of rain. The winds had started to pick up, causing the trees to sway and creak. I gathered my things, bundled up in my thick jacket, and made my way down to the lighthouse once again. I had decided to photograph the interior this time, something I had avoided up until now. There was something about the structure that felt wrong, as though it were keeping its secrets locked away in the shadows. But today, I couldn't resist. The job needed to be done, and I was determined to finish it. The path to the lighthouse felt longer than usual, as though the distance was stretching further with every step I took. My footsteps echoed in the thickening silence, and with each passing moment, the wind seemed to grow stronger, howling and whipping through the trees. By the time I reached the base of the lighthouse, the sky had darkened even more, and the air felt charged with something I couldn't quite explain. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the lighthouse. It was silent now, its once vibrant white paint long since peeled away, revealing the dull, weathered stone beneath. The door was still locked, the small hatch at the base still the only way in. I felt a strange compulsion to open it, to see what was inside. It was almost as if the lighthouse itself was calling to me. I hesitated. I had never been the type to give in to irrational feelings, but today was different. With a deep breath, I made my way toward the hatch and crouched down, fumbling with the rusted lock. It gave way with a groan, the sound of metal scraping against metal sending a shiver down my spine. I pulled the hatch open, revealing a narrow stairway that spiraled upwards into the dark. The scent of damp stone and decaying wood hit me immediately, and I could feel the temperature drop even further as I stepped inside. As I ascended the staircase, my flashlight illuminating the worn steps in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind outside seemed to press against the walls of the lighthouse, making them creak and groan as if the structure itself were alive. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone standing there, watching me from the shadows. But each time, the stairs remained empty. The higher I climbed, the colder it became. My breath began to fog in front of me, and I could feel the weight of the air pressing against my chest. The walls of the lighthouse were lined with old, rotting wooden beams, some of which had begun to split and buckle under the strain of years of neglect. As I reached the top of the staircase, I was met with a large open space, the lantern room, where the light used to shine for miles across the sea. The room was dark now, the glass windows cracked and streaked with years of dirt and grime. I stood in the center of the room, my flashlight flickering weakly as I panned it across the dusty floor. There was an old desk near the far wall, cluttered with broken tools and pieces of paper, some of them yellowed with age. I moved toward it, curious to see if there was anything of interest, when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The papers on the desk were moving, not in a way that was caused by the wind, but as if they were being disturbed by an unseen hand. I froze, staring at the papers as they shifted slightly, as though something invisible was sifting through them. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I was alone in the room. I knew that for sure. There was no one else in the lighthouse. So, what could have caused it? I told myself it was just the wind, the vibrations from the outside air moving the papers ever so slightly. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something was wrong here, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I quickly moved away from the desk, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just seen. It was the first time I had felt truly unsettled since arriving on the island, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to close in around me as I made my way back to the stairs, eager to leave the upper floor and return to the safety of the open air. As I descended the stairs, I heard a sound, soft, barely perceptible at first, but unmistakable. A faint tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse quickening. It was coming from above me, from the top of the lighthouse. I glanced upwards, but there was nothing there. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as if it were following me down the staircase. My breath caught in my throat as I rushed the last few steps, desperate to get out of the lighthouse. When I reached the base, I slammed the hatch shut behind me and stood there for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to make of it. Had I imagined it? Had the old structure simply groaned and shifted under the pressure of the wind? I tried to convince myself that it was just the building settling, but deep down, I knew I had felt something. Something that didn't belong. I didn't return to the lighthouse that day. Instead, I went back to the cottage, the unsettling incidents still playing over and over in my mind. It was then that I noticed something strange. The photographs I had taken earlier in the day of the lighthouse, the cliffs, the sky, were not what I had remembered capturing. In each photo, there was a shadow, a dark figure that hadn't been there when I took the shot. I flipped through them one by one, my hands trembling as I scanned each image. The shadow grew more distinct with each frame. It wasn't just a blur or a trick of the light. It was a figure standing just outside the frame, its outline clear against the darkening sky. My skin crawled as I stared at the photos. What was it? Who was it? I hadn't seen anyone while I was out there. There hadn't been a soul in sight. I spent the rest of the evening in a haze, my thoughts spinning as I tried to make sense of it all. The lighthouse, the papers, the tapping, and now the photos. Nothing made sense. I wanted to shake it off, to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was on that island, whatever was connected to the lighthouse, it wasn't ready to let me go. The next few days on the island blurred together in a haze of unease and heightened senses. I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, always just beyond my reach, waiting for me to turn a corner or glance away. I tried to push it aside, told myself it was just the isolation, the wind, the eerie silence that settled over the island at dusk. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the environment. It was something else, something far more insidious. I kept my distance from the lighthouse for the next few days, spending most of my time near the small cottage. I worked on my photos, cataloging the ones I had already taken and trying to make sense of what I had experienced. But as much as I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the sense of impending danger. It was as if the island itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then came the storm. The sky had been steadily darkening all morning, the clouds hanging low and thick, blotting out the sun. By midday, the winds had begun to pick up, sending the trees into a violent sway. I had planned on staying inside, but curiosity gnawed at me. The storm wasn't something to ignore. The lighthouse had been dormant for years, but now it stood there, looming over the landscape, daring me to confront whatever was hidden inside. I bundled up, bracing myself against the wind as I made my way down the path toward the lighthouse. The air had a sharp, salty tang to it, the smell of the sea mixed with the wetness of the coming rain. The storm was still a ways off, but the intensity of the winds made it feel like the island itself was on the verge of something. The closer I got to the lighthouse, the more uneasy I felt. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a sense of dread washed over me. It wasn't the storm, nor the winds that unsettled me. It was the lighthouse, silent, unmoving, as if it were waiting. I reached the hatch again, and this time I didn't hesitate. The lock was as rusted as before, but it gave way without too much effort. The moment I opened the door, I felt a sudden rush of cold air. It wasn't the wind, not the kind that was blowing outside. This was a different kind of cold, unnatural, biting, like something ancient was exhaling, a breath that hadn't been taken in years. I stepped inside, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I shone it around the dark stairwell. The silence was deafening. The familiar creaking of the lighthouse seemed to have ceased, replaced by a strange, almost unnatural stillness. Even the storm outside had quieted for a moment, as if it too were holding its breath. I began to climb the stairs again, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The closer I got to the top, the heavier the air became. It wasn't just cold anymore, it felt thick, like something was pressing in on me from all sides. As I reached the lantern room, I noticed something that sent a chill racing down my spine. The desk, the one I had seen a few days ago, was no longer cluttered with broken tools and papers. Instead, there were fresh markings, scratches, as if something had been dragged across the surface. But there was no sign of anyone having been there. I hadn't heard a soul, and the door had been locked when I arrived. So who, or what, had been inside? I couldn't tear my eyes away from the marks. They seemed almost deliberate, as if someone, or something, had left them for me to find. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The wind outside howled once more, but this time, the sound was different. It wasn't the usual roar or whistle that I'd grown used to. This was deeper, more guttural, as though the island itself was mourning. I turned away from the desk, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. I was no longer just uneasy, I was terrified. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot, unwilling to let go of the compulsion to investigate. I moved toward the windows, hoping to find some kind of explanation. I peered through the cracked glass, watching the storm roll in. The waves crashed violently against the rocks below, the sky blackening with each passing second. But even through the chaos of the storm, I saw something, a figure, standing at the edge of the cliff, just outside the lighthouse. It was tall, slender, and its silhouette was barely visible against the backdrop of the storm. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the figure was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I blinked, willing it to return, but there was nothing, just the wild, howling wind and the relentless crash of the waves. I backed away from the window, my head spinning. It had to have been a trick of the light, my mind playing games with me in the chaos of the storm. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. There had been something out there, something watching. I tried to calm my racing thoughts. There was no reason to panic. The island was isolated, yes, but it wasn't a place for ghosts or apparitions. It was just an old lighthouse, long abandoned, filled with nothing more than memories of a time long past. But even as I tried to convince myself of this, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. I spent the next few hours in the lighthouse, pacing and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The storm raged outside, but inside, there was only an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the buildings settling under the pressure of the wind. The more I looked around, the more I realized that the lighthouse itself seemed to be changing. It wasn't just the weather, it was something deeper, something intrinsic to the place. The walls were no longer just old and weathered. They were alive, it seemed. They seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't understand. The air around me felt thick, as though it was charged with static, and I could feel a pressure building in my chest, making it harder to breathe. The storm outside intensified, the winds howling like a chorus of voices. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run back to the cottage and never return. But something kept me here. The need to understand, to uncover whatever was lurking in the darkness, held me in place. I tried to focus on something, anything that could explain the strange occurrences. The desk was the obvious place to start. I moved closer to it, hoping to find some clue as to what was happening, when I noticed something else. The papers that had been on the desk, the ones that had been moved the other day, were now neatly stacked, as though someone had placed them there deliberately. I flipped through them, my hands trembling. The first few pages were filled with notes and sketches, but as I turned to the last page, I froze. It was a drawing, a crude, hastily scrawled image of the lighthouse. But the drawing was wrong. The proportions were off, and there was something sinister about it. The lighthouse was darker, more menacing, its shape twisted and distorted. At the bottom of the page, in uneven handwriting, was a single word: lost. I stumbled back from the desk, my mind racing. What was this? Who had drawn this? And why did it feel so wrong? I didn't wait around to find out. I turned and fled down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The storm outside was now a fury of wind and rain, but I barely noticed as I ran back to the cottage. The image of the twisted lighthouse burned into my mind. As I reached the door, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from earlier, standing in the doorway of the lighthouse, waiting for me. But there was nothing. The island was silent again, save for the howling wind and the crashing waves. But I knew better now. Whatever was on this island wasn't just in my head. It was real, and it was getting closer. I had spent hours that night pacing around the small cottage, my thoughts a jumbled mess of fear, confusion, and disbelief. The storm raged on outside, as if the island itself had become an angry, living entity, thrashing against the earth. Every now and then, the power would flicker, casting the room into darkness before the lights flickered back to life. It was the kind of night that made you question your own sanity. The image of the twisted lighthouse was burned into my mind. I couldn't shake it. The memory of the cold air that had seeped from the structure, the strange scratching sounds that had followed me, the feeling that something was watching me, it was all too much to ignore. And then there was the drawing, the crude sketch of the lighthouse, warped and wrong, with that single, chilling word beneath it: lost. I had no idea what it meant, but the deeper I thought about it, the more I felt its weight pressing against my chest. The storm had made everything feel even more unreal, as if the world itself was on the edge of something terrible. I tried to sleep, but my eyes refused to close. Every time I managed to drift off, a sudden noise, a creak of wood, a distant thud, would snap me back to consciousness. My nerves were frayed, every little sound sending me into a state of alert. I had to go back to the lighthouse. I had to know what was going on, what was waiting for me there. It was the only way to make sense of everything that had happened, or at least to understand why it felt as though I were slowly losing control of my own thoughts. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and headed out into the storm. The wind whipped against my face, and the rain soaked through my clothes within minutes, but I didn't care. The lighthouse was calling me, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The path to the lighthouse seemed longer than I remembered, the wind fighting me every step of the way. The closer I got, the more oppressive the air became. It felt like something was waiting for me, watching me from behind the mist and the shadows. But I couldn't turn back, not now. I reached the lighthouse door and tried the handle. It was locked again, just like before, but this time I didn't hesitate. I pulled a small crowbar from my coat pocket and forced the door open. It groaned in protest, but eventually it gave way. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, the heavy weight of something wrong, something that didn't belong. The temperature dropped, and the air felt thick and suffocating, as though it were alive with some unseen presence. I hesitated on the threshold, but only for a moment. There was no turning back now. I moved inside, the floor creaking beneath my feet with every step. My flashlight flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist around me. I didn't stop to think about how eerie the place had become. I had a job to do. I had to find out what was behind the strange occurrences, the cold air, the drawings, the feeling of being watched. I had to face whatever had been calling me here. I made my way up the stairs again, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The storm outside was louder now, the sound of the wind pressing against the walls of the lighthouse like an angry force. But inside, everything was eerily quiet, too quiet. I reached the top of the stairs and entered the lantern room. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear, just a raw, aching need to uncover the truth. The room was just as I had left it, but something was different. The desk was still there, but now it seemed almost alive. The papers were scattered across the surface in a frenzy, as if someone or something had been rifling through them. The strange markings from earlier had grown more pronounced, as though they were becoming more deeply etched into the wood with every passing moment. But it was the drawing that caught my attention. It was no longer just a simple sketch of the lighthouse. This time, the lines were sharper, more defined, and the lighthouse was distorted beyond recognition. The words beneath it were different now. There was no longer just lost. Instead, the word had been crossed out and replaced with something more terrifying. Found. A chill ran down my spine. My breath caught in my throat. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever this was, it wasn't just a story or a legend. This was real. And whatever had happened to those who had come before me, it was happening again. It was happening to me. Suddenly, the sound of a door creaking open broke the silence. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, straining to hear over the deafening roar of the wind. The storm outside had taken on a life of its own, but this sound, it was closer. Much closer. I turned toward the sound, but there was no one there. Nothing but the empty, still air and the pitch-black shadows that clung to every corner of the room. And then I heard it. A voice, soft, faint, but unmistakably there. It was as if it was coming from all around me, surrounding me, pressing in on me. The voice whispered my name. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was dry, tight, as though something was choking me from the inside. I stumbled back, my eyes darting around the room in panic, but there was no escape. The shadows seemed to grow longer, more oppressive, the air heavier with each passing second. The storm raged outside, but inside, it was as if the very air itself had stopped moving. The voice whispered again, this time louder, closer. It wasn't just my name this time. It was calling me to come closer, to follow, to enter the darkness. I couldn't do it. I had to get out of there. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the very ground beneath me had frozen, anchoring me to the spot. And then I saw it. From the corner of my eye, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, dark, its features obscured by the darkness. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure took a step forward, and I felt a sudden coldness wash over me, as if the air itself had frozen. My breath caught in my throat, and I finally managed to take a step back. But the figure followed, its presence growing stronger with each step it took toward me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. It was as if it were inside my head, pulling at my thoughts, digging into my deepest fears. The voice came again, clearer now, and I realized, with a sickening shock, that it wasn't a single voice. It was many, whispers, murmurs, all of them overlapping, all of them calling out to me, begging me to listen. I couldn't take it anymore. I broke free from the trance, bolting toward the door, but the moment I reached it, the figure was there, standing in the doorway, blocking my escape. The shadows seemed to reach out, tugging at me, pulling me closer to the figure. I could feel the coldness radiating from it, the emptiness that consumed everything in its path. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and I could feel my body shaking uncontrollably. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. The whispers faded, the storm outside roaring louder than ever. I was alone. But was I? I turned and ran down the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would explode. My feet flew over the steps, and before I knew it, I was back outside, gasping for air as the storm battered me from all sides. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The lighthouse loomed behind me, dark and silent once more, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew better now. Whatever had been waiting for me in that lighthouse, it was still there, lurking, and it wasn't going to let me go. Not now. Not ever. When I finally reached the cottage, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The wind outside howled with a ferocity I hadn't noticed before, as if the island itself was trying to push me back into the darkness. My heart still raced, and my chest felt tight with panic. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, the cold, empty space where it had stood. It was as if the thing had been part of the storm itself, a manifestation of everything that had gone wrong on this island. I forced myself to sit down, to breathe, to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made. Everything I had thought I understood about the lighthouse, about the strange occurrences, about the drawings, seemed meaningless now. The figure had been real. I had seen it. But who or what had it been? Was it the ghost of someone who had once lived here, trapped in the island's isolation? Or was it something more? Something ancient, beyond human understanding? I glanced at the desk where the drawing had been earlier, the one with the distorted lighthouse and the word found beneath it. It was gone. The desk was empty, the papers discarded as if they had never been there. Had I imagined it all? Had the stress of the night gotten to me, made me see things that weren't there? But no, I had felt the presence in the room. I had heard the voices. And I knew what I had seen. I couldn't stay here. Not after what had happened. Not after what I had encountered. The island had a pull, something I couldn't explain, and it wasn't done with me yet. Whatever that thing was, it hadn't finished its work. I had to leave, to escape before it caught up with me again. The storm raged on, but I grabbed my bag and threw whatever belongings I could into it. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't focus on anything except getting as far away from the lighthouse as possible. I shoved the door open and stepped back into the storm. The rain pelted me, the wind tugging at my clothes, but I barely noticed it. All I could think about was putting distance between myself and whatever that thing was. I moved quickly, my steps unsure but determined. The path back to the boat felt longer this time, the shadows more oppressive, the silence heavier. I could still feel the cold touch of that figure on my skin, as if it had marked me, branded me somehow. The voices echoed in my mind, a chorus of whispers that never seemed to stop. As I approached the boat, I heard the faint sound of something, footsteps. It was distant, but it was there. I turned quickly, but there was nothing behind me. Just the howling wind and the steady pounding of the waves against the shore. But that didn't make sense. I had been alone. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear that had settled in my thoughts. I had to leave. Now. I climbed into the boat and untied the ropes with shaky hands. My heart hammered in my chest, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. But there was nothing. No figure in the darkness, no sound, just the storm and the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to press against my chest. The engine roared to life, and I pushed the throttle forward, the boat cutting through the water faster than I had ever gone before. The lighthouse loomed behind me, its silhouette barely visible in the heavy rain and mist. I didn't look back. I couldn't. It felt as though the very air around me was trying to drag me back, but I refused to be pulled under. I couldn't stay. The farther I went, the more the tension in my chest eased, but the questions remained. What had I seen? What had that thing wanted? Was I the next victim of whatever curse had taken hold of that lighthouse? Or had I just been a visitor to something far older, something far darker than I could comprehend? I don't know how long I stayed out on the water. Time lost all meaning in the chaos of the storm. But when it finally began to subside, I was miles from the island, the lighthouse barely visible on the horizon. The air felt lighter, less oppressive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. That the island still had a hold on me, even if I was far away. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Had I really encountered something supernatural, or had the isolation, the storm, and the stress twisted my mind into creating horrors that weren't really there? The doubts gnawed at me, eating away at the certainty I had once had. But as the sun began to rise, casting its pale light over the water, I knew one thing for sure. I would never return to that lighthouse. No matter how curious I was, no matter how much I needed answers, I would never step foot on that island again. Something had been waiting for me there. Something that wasn't human, and it wasn't done with me yet. Weeks passed. The storm eventually gave way to clear skies, and the memories of that night began to fade, buried under the weight of everyday life. I tried to go back to normal. I tried to pretend that I hadn't experienced what I had. But it lingered. That feeling of being watched, of something just out of reach, never quite went away. And I couldn't stop thinking about the drawing, the word found, and what it had meant. I tried to reach out to local authorities, to find someone who could explain what had happened. But no one would talk about the lighthouse. No one would acknowledge its existence, and when I pushed, I was met with silence. The island was abandoned, they said. It was just a relic of the past, nothing more. But I knew better. I knew there was something there, something that shouldn't have been. I left the island behind, but I couldn't escape the feeling that it wasn't finished with me. I had questions, too many questions, and I didn't have answers. But what happened at the lighthouse had changed me, deep down. And I don't think it'll ever be the same again. As for the island, it remains just as it was, a dark, lonely place in the middle of the storm, holding its secrets tightly, waiting for the next person foolish enough to seek them out. I won't be the one to return, but it'll never forget. Months have passed since that night on the island, but every so often, I find myself revisiting those memories. The storm, the lighthouse, the figure in the shadows. Each time I close my eyes, it's as if the island pulls me back, the wind howling in my ears, the cold creeping over me once more. I try not to think about it. I try to move on. Life goes on, after all. But sometimes, in the quiet moments when my mind drifts, the memories return with vivid intensity. That feeling of dread, of something watching me, something waiting just out of sight, never quite leaves. It lingers in the corners of my thoughts, just enough to make me question my sanity. Was it real? Or was it a trick of the mind, brought on by isolation and exhaustion? The island, with its secrets and mysteries, remains distant. The lighthouse stands as a reminder of that night, but it's also something I've had to push away from my mind. I never returned to look for answers. No one else ever spoke about it, and whenever the topic of that island came up, the conversations quickly died. It was as if no one wanted to acknowledge the place at all. But even in the safety of the city, where the noise of the world drowns out the echoes of the storm, there are moments when I feel like I'm still there. Alone, stranded, with something waiting in the shadows. I don't tell people about what happened, not because I don't want to, but because I can't. How can you explain to someone the feeling of being in a place that doesn't want you there? How can you describe a presence that's so tangible, so real, but so far beyond your understanding? I think about the drawings I found, the strange, distorted versions of the lighthouse. I can't help but wonder if they were warnings, warnings that I didn't heed. I had been curious, naive even, thinking that I could simply explore and leave with my curiosity satisfied. But I left with so much more than I bargained for. The drawings, the whispers in the wind, the way the island seemed to reach out to me, they weren't just signs. They were messages, But messages from whom? Or what? The hardest part of all this is the uncertainty. I never got to the bottom of what happened that night. I never figured out what that figure was, or why it was there, or why I was the one to encounter it. Was it the spirit of someone who had once lived there? Was it a manifestation of the island itself, of all the isolation and sorrow it had witnessed over the years? Or was it something darker? Something that had been waiting, dormant, for a moment like mine to bring it back to life? Maybe I'll never know. What's most unsettling is the feeling that the island still has a hold on me. It's not a physical thing. There's no force trying to drag me back, but it's as if the island is still with me, a part of me. I've tried to convince myself that it was just an event, a moment of high stress and fear, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I know that the island wasn't just a place. It was something more, something that reaches out, something that knows how to leave its mark on those who dare to seek it. There are days when I hear the storm again, in the background of my thoughts. The sound of the wind, the relentless rush of the waves against the rocks. It's as if the island is calling me, reminding me of what I left behind. And then there are nights when I feel it, the cold presence of something standing just out of sight, watching, waiting. I've tried to return to normal, to put this behind me, but I can't forget. I can't forget the figure, the eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness, the way the air had felt so heavy, so thick with something I couldn't define. Was it the island itself? Was it something ancient, something that had been there long before the lighthouse? I'll never know for sure. But I've come to accept that there are some things in this world that can't be explained, no matter how hard we try to make sense of them. Some places, some events, leave scars that never quite fade. They become a part of who we are, buried deep inside, even if we don't talk about them, even if we try to move on. I know one thing for certain, though. I will never go back to that island. No matter what curiosity or need for answers gnaws at me, I will never set foot on that cursed, desolate place again. And if anyone ever asks me about it, about the lighthouse, about the island, I'll simply tell them I don't know. Maybe I'll even tell them it was nothing, just a bad experience. But deep down, I'll know the truth. The island will always be there, waiting. And no matter how far I run, I will never truly escape what I felt that night.